The Millard County Marriage Exchange operated out of a converted feed store on the eastern edge of Calhoun Flats, Nebraska, and it smelled exactly like what it was. A place where desperation had been doing business for years. The walls were raw timber that hadn't seen paint since the building's previous life, and the floor was packed dirt covered over with sawdust that the owner, a red-faced man named Purvis Crane, swept out and replaced every Friday morning before the proceedings began. There were 24 mismatched chairs arranged in rows facing a low wooden platform, and above the platform hung a hand-lettered sign that read, Millard County Placement Services, in letters that had been touched up so many times the paint had begun to crack and bubble along the edges. Gideon Hartwell sat in the last row. He'd chosen that seat deliberately, the way he chose most things, quietly, without announcing his reasoning to anyone. From the back he could see the whole room, who was there, who was sweating, who had come with money, and who had come with nothing but the hope that today might be the day something in their lives finally shifted. He recognized a few faces. Halsey Drummond from the Feed Cooperative. Two brothers from out near the Platte, who ran a middling cattle operation and always seemed to be looking for shortcuts. A railroad clerk whose name Gideon had never learned, but whose face he'd seen at enough county events to place him. None of them knew quite what to make of Gideon's presence. He saw them noticing him, watched their eyes dart back, and once or twice heard his name murmured in a way that was meant to carry. He didn't care. He hadn't come for their opinions. He'd come because his foreman, a practical and frequently irritating man named Dutch Alderman, had told him straight to his face 3 weeks ago that the Hartwell operation needed a woman in the main house, or it was going to continue falling apart in ways that no amount of hired labor could fix. Dutch had said this over supper, which he'd cooked himself because the last cook had quit in October, and the supper had been so bad, some combination of salt pork and underboiled potatoes that had the texture of wet clay, that Gideon had found it difficult to argue. "You need a wife," Dutch had said, not looking up from his plate, "or at minimum, someone who knows what a household actually requires. Place is going to seed, Gideon. I mean that as respectfully as I'm able." "I've had 2 wives," Gideon said. "I know it. Neither one worked out." "I know that too." Dutch finally looked up. He was 61, weathered down to something close to wood, and had been with the Hartwell operation for 19 years. He had a way of stating facts that made them feel geological, like something that had been forming for a very long time and was now simply arriving. "The difference now is you're 53 years old and running 3,000 acres with no heirs and no household management, and a bunkhouse full of men who are starting to wonder if this place has a future worth staying for." Gideon had said nothing to that because there was nothing to say. So here he was, sitting in a feed store that smelled like old grain and human anxiety, watching Purvis Crane work his way down a list of women who had, through one circumstance or another, arrived at the point where this was the available option. Most of the transactions were businesslike. A farmer from out near Dunning took a young woman barely past 20 who looked frightened but composed. A widower with 4 children took a woman in her 30s who appeared to have made her calculations and was satisfied with the result. Money changed hands. Papers were signed at a folding table by the door. Crane moved through his list with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and felt no particular way about it. Then he called the name Vivian Cross. She came out from behind the partition at the side of the platform with the kind of posture that people develop not from good breeding, but from long practice at refusing to be diminished. Her dress was dark brown wool, clean but worn thin at the elbows, and she carried a carpet bag that she set down at her feet with a deliberateness that suggested she'd thought about that small action. Where to put it, how to hold herself when she did. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pulled back simply and a face that was neither pretty in the conventional sense nor plain. It was specific, the kind of face that looked like it belonged to someone who had been somewhere and seen things and formed opinions about them. She was 34 years old. Gideon knew this from the sheet Crane had passed around before the proceedings started. Twice widowed. No children. That last notation had been underlined, and beside it someone had written in pencil, medically confirmed, Barren. Crane cleared his throat. Vivian Cross, formerly of Kearney, before that of Hastings. Widow, 2 marriages, no issue. She's in good health, experienced in household management, and comes with her own effects. He gestured at the carpet bag. Starting bid, $60. The room was quiet, not the polite quiet of consideration. the quiet of collective decision-making that had already been made. Gideon watched the faces. He saw Drummond glance at the floor. He saw the railroad clerk examine his own hands. The brothers from the Platte looked at each other with the particular communication of men who have agreed on something without speaking. $60, Crane said again. Do I have 60? Nothing. 50 then. $50 for a woman with household experience and her own effects. The silence continued. Someone in the third row shifted in his chair, and the sound of it was startlingly loud. On the platform, Vivian Cross stood very still. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't looking at any particular face in the crowd. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the heads of the assembled men, and her expression was one that Gideon found himself studying. Not pity, not resignation. Something more contained than either of those things. Like she had already done the accounting and arrived at a number and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. $40, Crane said with slightly less conviction. Come on now, gentlemen, $40 is a bargain for... She's Barren. This from the railroad clerk, stated not unkindly but with the finality of a man making a practical point. What's the value in that? No offense intended, ma'am. Vivian's eyes moved to the clerk. She didn't respond. $30, Crane tried. $30. Anyone? Gideon watched her jaw tighten. It was barely perceptible, just a slight shift along the line of muscle below her ear. And then it was gone, and she was composed again. But he'd seen it. That small, controlled effort of a person forcing herself to remain present in a situation that was, by any honest measure, humiliating beyond what most people could tolerate without fracturing. $20, Crane said, and now his voice had taken on a quality of genuine discomfort. Surely someone... I'll bid. The voice came from the back of the room, Gideon's own voice, and it sounded strange to him in this space. Too large for the low ceiling, too certain for the mood that had settled over the room. Every head turned. He stood up slowly. He was a big man, not running to fat, but built with the density of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and hadn't yet stopped. And he was aware of how much space he took up in a room like this, and he used that awareness deliberately. $1, he said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence, dense with confusion, and underneath that the first stirrings of offense, because $1 for a person was an insult, and everyone in the room understood that, and they were waiting to understand what kind of insult Gideon Hartwell intended. $1, Crane repeated slowly, for a conversation, Gideon said. He wasn't talking to Crane. He was looking at Vivian Cross, who had for the first time shifted her gaze from the fixed point above the crowd and was now looking directly at him. I'm not buying anything. I don't have any interest in purchasing a person. He kept his voice even. I have a proposition to make, and I'd like the opportunity to make it, and I'm willing to pay $1 for that opportunity if that's what's required. That's not, Crane started. 20 acres of my property borders your cousin's grazing land up north, Gideon said to Crane without looking at him. I'm willing to forget a surveying dispute that's been sitting on my desk for 8 months if you let me have 5 minutes. A beat. Then Crane said, 5 minutes. Quote. They stood outside in the cold, on the side of the building away from the door where no one could see them easily, though Gideon was sure someone was watching from the corner anyway. The wind came down off the flat land and had nothing between it and them, and it pushed Vivian's skirt against her legs and lifted a few strands of her hair that had come loose from their arrangement. She held her carpet bag with both hands and waited. She hadn't asked what this was about. She was letting him speak first, which told him something. My name is Gideon Hartwell, he said. I run the Hartwell operation east of here, about 22 miles, 3,000 acres, cattle primarily, some horses, a working household. I know who you are, she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, flat and dry, without the softness that women were often expected to perform. Everyone in the county knows who you are. Then you know I've been married twice. Ellen Marsh, and before that Clara Boone. Both dead. No children. She said it without particular affect. Just information, cleanly stated. Are you offering to marry me, Mr. Hartwell? I'm offering something different. He looked at her directly. I've had 2 marriages that were arrangements. Both women knew what they were getting into, and both of them were decent women, and neither one of those marriages worked for reasons I'm not going to pretend I don't have some responsibility for. He paused. What I'm proposing is an honest conversation, not a transaction. I'm proposing that we both speak plainly about what our situations actually are, and then you can decide whether what I'm suggesting is worth considering. She studied him. Whatever calculation she was doing it visibly, not hiding it. Go ahead, she said. My household is in a bad state. My foreman has told me so directly, and he's right. I have 23 men working that land and no one managing the domestic side of the operation with any real skill. And it shows. The men are eating badly, the house is cold because no one's paying attention to where the heat goes, and there's no organization to anything that happens inside those walls. He put his hands in his pockets, not because he was cold, though he was, but because he didn't know what else to do with them. I need a partner, someone capable, practical, and willing to work, not someone who wants to sit in a parlor and be decorative. What I read on that sheet, she said, was barren, underlined. That doesn't concern you? It concerns me less than some of the alternatives. Most men want children. I'm 53 years old, Mrs. Cross. My relationship with the idea of children is more complicated than it was at 30. He looked out at the flat land for a moment and then back at her. I'd be lying if I said it was nothing to me. I'm not going to do that. But I'm also not going to pretend it's the whole of what I'm looking for, because it isn't. She was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed between them. 2 marriages, she said. What went wrong? The directness of it caught him slightly off balance, which he suspected was intentional. Clara died in childbirth. The child didn't survive either. That was 18 years ago. He stopped. Ellen was a capable woman who deserved better than what I gave her, which was a house in the middle of nowhere and a husband who was more interested in building something than in talking to anyone about how it felt to be part of it. She lasted 4 years. Then she went back east, and I don't blame her. Vivian Cross looked at him for a long moment. You're honest, she said, as if this was a thing she was deciding rather than a compliment she was offering. When it serves a purpose. What would this look like, practically? You'd have authority over the household, real authority, not the kind that's given and then taken back. You'd manage the domestic operations, the accounts that fall under that, the staff. You'd be treated with respect by everyone on that property, or they'd be gone. He said the last part without emphasis, which made it sound more like a fact than a promise. In return, I'd ask for genuine effort and honest dealing. No pretending things are fine when they aren't. No performance. And the marriage itself? He met her eyes. I'm proposing a legal arrangement that protects you. What it becomes beyond that would depend on what both of us choose. He paused. I'm not going to make you promises about what I feel because I don't know what I feel. I know what I need, and I've told you that. The rest I'm prepared to be honest about as we go. Vivian set her carpet bag down on the frozen ground, and Gideon had the impression that this was a decision, that putting the bag down was the physical expression of something she was choosing. She looked at the side of the building for a moment, and then back at him. I was married the first time at 19, she said. George Cross. He was a farmer, not a bad man, but he wanted sons and I gave him 7 years and no children, and he died before he'd quite finished being disappointed in me. The second one, she stopped. The second one I don't want to discuss, except to tell you that he wasn't a good man, and that my time in that house showed me clearly what the difference looks like between a man who sees you and a man who only sees what you're supposed to provide. All right. I know how to run a household, I know accounts, I know food preservation, I know how to manage people who don't want to be managed, and I know when something's going wrong before it's gone far enough to be a crisis. She lifted her chin slightly. I'm not going to be decorative, and I'm not going to be grateful in a way that makes me easy to disregard. I'll work, and I'll be honest, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong. Good, Gideon said. I'm often wrong. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, gone quickly. And if this doesn't work, then we deal with that honestly when we get there. I won't leave you worse off than you are now. That's the one promise I'm prepared to make. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag. $1, she said. That's what you paid for this conversation. That's what I paid. I hope it was worth it to you, Mr. Hartwell. I suspect it was, Mrs. Cross. She nodded once, a small and precise motion. Then let's go sign whatever needs signing. They went back inside and signed the papers at Crane's folding table. and several of the men watched this with expressions that ranged from puzzlement to the particular resentment of people who have decided something has no value and are then unsettled to find someone disagreeing with their assessment. Drummond said something to the railroad clerk that Gideon didn't catch but didn't need to. He'd heard those sentences before in different forms. He paid Crane the dollar, a real dollar, a silver coin that he set on the table with a small flat sound. And Crane looked at it, and then looked at Gideon, and then wrote something in his ledger without comment. Vivian signed her name in a clear, unhurried hand. Vivian Ann Cross, then the date, and then she set the pen down and straightened up. Outside, the wagon was waiting. Gideon's man, a young hand named Sully, who had been sent to wait with the horses, came around when he saw them emerge. He looked at Vivian with frank curiosity, and then at Gideon, and then at the carpet bag, and then he seemed to decide that his job was the horses and not the understanding of situations, and he went back to being useful. "It's about 2 hours," Gideon said, meaning the drive. "I know," Vivian said. She climbed up onto the wagon without waiting for assistance. Not rudely, simply practically, the way someone climbs into a wagon when they've been climbing into wagons their whole life and have never thought of it as something requiring ceremony. Gideon climbed up on his side. Sully got in the back. They pulled out onto the road, and the feed store got small behind them, and the flat Nebraska land opened up ahead of them in its winter colors, brown and gray, and the pale yellow of dead grass, vast and indifferent and cold. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wagon creaked. The horses breathed. "What's it like?" Vivian said eventually, not looking at him, looking out at the land. "The ranch?" "Yes." He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Big," he said. "Cold right now. The house is larger than it needs to be and not managed well, which you already know. The men are decent workers, most of them." He paused. "It runs on a kind of fear that I didn't intend and don't entirely know how to fix. When I built it, I wasn't thinking about what kind of place it would be to live in. I was thinking about what kind of operation it would be." She turned to look at him. "Fear of you? Of disappointing me, which is different, though not by as much as I'd like." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've been told I'm difficult to know." "By whom?" "Anyone who's tried." She looked back at the road. "That's either honest or it's a warning." "Probably both." Another stretch of silence. The sky ahead of them was beginning to lose its light along the western edge, the gray deepening toward the flat dark of a plains evening. "I buried a husband 7 months ago," Vivian said. She said it without particular weight, the way you state a fact that has been lived with long enough to be stated plainly. "He drank. The drinking was the least of it." She didn't elaborate and Gideon didn't press. "I came back to Kearney after because my sister was there, and she was kind. But she has her own family and her own situation, and she couldn't carry me indefinitely. So." She gestured loosely at the wagon, the road, the diminishing afternoon. "So here I am." "Here you are," Gideon agreed. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I didn't come to that place today to be rescued. I came because it was the available option, and I made a calculation about it, the same as you did." She paused. "I don't need you to feel sorry for me." "I don't," he said. "I felt something closer to respect, if I'm honest." "For what?" "For standing on that platform the way you did, not looking at the floor." She was quiet for a moment. "It's just pride," she said. "Not a virtue, necessarily." "Maybe not, but it's something." The first lights of the ranch appeared at the edge of the horizon, small and yellow against the darkening sky. A cluster of structures that resolved slowly as they drew closer into something that Gideon supposed could be called a homestead, if you were being charitable, or a collection of buildings with ambitions if you were being accurate. The main house was large, 2 stories, built of good timber with a wide porch that had gone slightly crooked on the left side where the foundation had settled. Behind it, the bunkhouse, the stables, the equipment barn, 3 or 4 smaller structures in varying states of repair. Vivian looked at it as they approached. She didn't say anything. Dutch Alderman was on the porch. He always seemed to know when things were arriving, possibly because he had nothing else to think about during the long stretches of work and had developed a kind of radar for events. He watched them pull up with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man reserving judgment. "Dutch," Gideon said, climbing down. "This is Mrs. Cross." She'll be taking over management of the household. Dutch looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Dutch. I know what you're wondering, she said to him directly. How long this will last and whether I know what I'm getting into, and whether you're going to have to manage around me the way you've been managing around the absence of anyone competent. She climbed down from the wagon. The answers are, I don't know, probably yes, and no. She picked up her carpet bag. Where's the kitchen? Dutch blinked. Then he looked at Gideon, who gave him nothing, and then he looked back at Vivian. Back of the house, he said. Through the main hall, left at the stairs, all the way down. Thank you. She went up the porch steps and through the front door without stopping. Dutch watched the door for a moment after it closed. Well, he said. Yes, Gideon said. Where'd you find her? At the exchange. Dutch was quiet for another moment. $1 well spent, he said finally, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. The kitchen was the worst room in the house, which was saying something. Vivian stood in it and did a thorough inventory. The range was a good one, a Monarch cast iron, probably 10 years old, well-built and maintained reasonably. But the organization around it was chaos. Supplies stacked without system, the cold pantry running nearly empty. A collection of pots that hadn't been properly seasoned in what looked like months, and surfaces that had been wiped but not scrubbed, which was a distinction that mattered. There was a smell of old grease, and underneath that, the sharper smell of something that had been allowed to go wrong in a corner somewhere. She opened the pantry and counted what was there. She opened every cabinet. She filled a mental ledger that was organized and precise, and she did not, at any point, feel despair about the state of it, because despair was not useful and what was here could be fixed. A girl appeared in the doorway, 15 or 16, with red hair and the skittish attention of someone who had learned to be unobtrusive. She stared at Vivian. You work in here? Vivian asked. Sometimes. I'm Nell. I do laundry mostly, but Mr. Alderman sometimes puts me in the kitchen when there's no one else. Can you cook? A little. Not well. All right. Vivian turned back to the pantry. What do the men eat for breakfast? Whatever gets made, usually corn mush or biscuits. The biscuits aren't very good. What makes them bad? Nell blinked, apparently not having expected a follow-up question. Too much flour? I'm not sure. They're heavy. Are you measuring the leavening or going by feel? By feel, I think. Whoever makes them. That's the problem. Vivian closed the pantry. Tomorrow morning we'll do biscuits properly, and I'll show you the ratio. It's not complicated, it's just specific. She looked around the kitchen again. Tonight I need to know what's available for supper, because there are at minimum 20 men who need to eat, and whatever's happening now isn't adequate. Nell looked alarmed. I can't. I'm not able to. I'm not asking you to do it. I'm asking you to show me where everything is, and then stay out of my way while I figure out what's possible. Vivian set her carpet bag by the door. What's that smell, by the way? The one coming from the back left corner. There's a potato barrel. Some of them went bad. Show me. They went through the kitchen together, Nell pointing and explaining and visibly recalibrating her assessment of this woman as she went. By the time they'd covered the entire space, something had shifted. Nell was still cautious, but the alarm had left her, replaced by something closer to attention. At 7 o'clock, supper appeared on the long table in the dining room. Not elaborate. There wasn't time or material for elaborate, but hot and organized and considerably better than what the men had been eating. Salt pork prepared properly, with the fat rendered and the meat browned rather than boiled to gray. Cornbread that had been cooked at the right temperature. Potatoes that had been picked through so that only the good ones were used, cut and cooked with a little of the rendered fat so that they had actual flavor. The men filed in and sat down, and there was the ordinary noise of a working supper. The scrape of chairs, the clink of tin. And then it got quieter than it usually did, in the way that rooms get quiet when people are noticing something without wanting to announce that they're noticing it. Gideon sat at the head of the table. Vivian sat at the far end, where she could see the room. She ate without talking, listening to the shape of the conversation, noting names and dynamics, and the particular way this group of men arranged themselves around each other. Who deferred to whom? Who was the informal voice? Who was quiet and watching in the way that often indicated either intelligence or grievance? Dutch sat 2 seats to Gideon's right, and made no comment about the food, which Vivian already understood was how he communicated approval. Afterward, one of the older hands, a man named Clarence, who had the calloused hands and the slightly bowed posture of someone who had been writing since before most of the others were born, stopped by where she was clearing the end of the table. "That was a decent supper, ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. No performance of modesty, no deflection, just acknowledgement. He nodded once and went out, and she heard the door to the bunkhouse close behind him. The room Gideon had prepared for her was upstairs, across the hall from his own, and it was spare but decent. A bed with a good mattress, a washstand, a window that looked east over the dark flat of the land. Someone had put a quilt on the bed that looked like it had been chosen with actual attention, old but well made, the kind of thing that gets kept because it meant something to someone. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her boots off and set them by the door, and then she sat with her hands in her lap for a moment and let herself be still, which she had not permitted herself to be all day. She was 34 years old in a house she had never seen before, in a county she barely knew, with a man she had met 6 hours ago. She had one carpet bag and $12 in the bottom of it, and a set of skills that she had spent her adult life developing without ever being given particular credit for them. She was also, for the first time since she could clearly remember, in a situation that felt like it had the possibility of something. She wasn't sure what to do with that sensation. It was unfamiliar enough to be slightly uncomfortable, the way warmth is uncomfortable when you've been cold for a very long time. She lay down on top of the quilt without changing, because she was too tired to bother, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about the man sitting across the hall, the specific quality of his honesty, which was real, she was sure of that, but was also the honesty of a person who had spent a long time being answerable to no one and had developed the habit of stating his own terms as if they were simply the facts of a situation. She thought he could be wrong about a great many things without knowing it. She thought she could work with that. She thought about the dollar he'd put on Crane's table, the flat silver sound of it, and the way the room had shifted when he stood up in the back. Not an act of charity. She understood that clearly. An act of pragmatism, same as hers. Two people arriving at the same calculation from different sides. What happened next would depend, she supposed, on whether the calculation was right. She closed her eyes. Somewhere below, she could hear the house settling into itself. The particular sounds of a large structure in a cold night, the groan and pop of timber, the distant low of cattle somewhere on the dark land, the wind along the eaves. It was not comfortable exactly. It was not what she would have chosen, but it was real. And she had learned in 34 years that real was what you worked with. The wind pushed against the window glass. Vivian Cross, who had been valued at $0 and accepted one, lay in a stranger's house in Nebraska and fell asleep to the sound of a frontier night doing what frontier nights did, pressing in from all sides, indifferent and enormous, leaving you to make of it what you could. The first morning she woke before the house did. That was habit, deep and old, and not something she thought about. In the second marriage, she had learned to be up before anyone else as a matter of self-preservation, because the early hours before the rest of the household stirred were the only ones that belonged entirely to her. She had carried that habit out of that house and into every situation since, and she supposed she would carry it for the rest of her life. She dressed in the dark, found the kitchen by memory. She had mapped it carefully the night before, and had the range going and water heating before the sky outside had lightened past the color of ash. She stood at the window while the kettle worked and looked out at the yard. The bunkhouse was dark. The stable showed a thin line of light under the door, which meant someone was already with the horses, which told her something useful about the operation's rhythm. She found coffee in a tin that had been pushed to the back of the upper cabinet behind 2 empty jars and a broken strainer. There was enough for a proper pot. She made it strong, because strong was what working men needed, and also what she needed on mornings like this one, when she was standing in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, in a house that might never feel like hers, doing the calculation all over again with fresh information. The calculation came out the same as it had the night before. The situation was manageable. Not easy. She had no illusions about easy, but manageable. And manageable was enough to work with. Gideon appeared at 6:15. She heard him on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps, the walk of a big man who had spent decades rising early and had no pretensions about it. And then he was in the kitchen doorway, dressed for work, his hair not yet fully situated. He looked at the range, at the coffee, at her, in that order. "You're up," he said. "I'm always up," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which she noted and filed away. It meant he was more comfortable here than he'd presented himself as being the night before, or it meant he was testing something. She wasn't sure which yet. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him and then went back to the biscuits, because the ratio needed attention and she was working with a flour she hadn't used before and wasn't sure of its density. "The potato barrel in the back of the cold pantry," she said, without turning around. "About a third of it needs to go. There's rot spreading, and if you leave it another week, you'll lose the whole thing." Noted. "The lard tin by the range is almost empty, and whoever ordered last didn't account for winter use. You'll need at minimum twice what's currently on order if you're feeding 23 men through to March. Can you write that down? For Dutch? I'll write him a full list this afternoon." A pause, the sound of him drinking coffee. "How's the room?" "Fine." She worked the dough. "The quilt's good, old but well made." "That was Clara's," he said. "The first one. I wasn't thinking when I had Nell put it in there. If it bothers you, I can have her take it out." Vivian considered that. "It doesn't bother me," she said, which was true, though she appreciated that he'd thought to say it. "A quilt's a quilt. It kept me warm." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the beginning of something else that he decided not to finish. "I want to walk the whole property today," she said. "The house, the grounds immediately around it, the storage structures. Not the pastures. That's not my concern yet, but everything that touches the domestic operation. I'll have Dutch take you." "I'd rather go alone." She turned to look at him. "I'll see it differently if someone's explaining it to me versus if I'm just looking at it." He held her gaze for a moment, and she had the impression he was adjusting something in his assessment. "All right," he said. She spent 4 hours walking. The house first, all of it. Every room, including the ones that had clearly not been used in years and smelled of accumulated time, closed windows, and the particular staleness of spaces where nothing happens. The parlor had furniture arranged as if someone had set it up once, and no one had sat in it since, which was probably close to the truth. The second bedroom on the east end had boxes stacked in it that hadn't been opened. One of the upstairs rooms was used for storage of equipment that should have been in the barn. She made notes on a piece of paper she'd found in the kitchen. Not elaborate notes, just a running record of what needed doing, organized by urgency. The immediate things. The things that could wait a month. The things that were problems in progress versus problems that were going to become crises. Outside, she walked the storage structures in order. The equipment barn was relatively organized, which told her Dutch alderman ran a tight ship where he had clear authority. The secondary storage shed was not organized, which told her it fell into a gray area of responsibility that no one had claimed. The smokehouse hadn't been properly maintained. The seals on 2 of the ventilation points were deteriorating, which meant they were losing heat efficiency, which meant they were wasting fuel. She noted all of it. The men she encountered during her walk treated her with varying degrees of wariness. A few nodded. One tipped his hat with the exaggerated courtesy of someone performing politeness, while uncertain what the actual protocol was. A young hand she hadn't seen at supper stopped what he was doing entirely and stared until an older man next to him said something quiet, and he went back to work. She was accustomed to this. The adjustment period, she had come to understand, was not about her. It was about the category she represented suddenly being occupied by a specific person, and the specific person not matching the shape the category implied. She gave it time and kept walking. By the time she was done, she had 3 pages of notes and a clear picture of where the energy was going and where it was being lost. The house ran on a combination of habit and improvisation, which produced the specific kind of disorder that's hard to see from inside it, but is immediately obvious from outside. Things got done because individuals did them out of accumulated practice, but there was no system connecting those individual efforts, which meant everything depended on specific people, and nothing could survive those people having a bad week, getting sick, or leaving. That was the problem. She'd seen it before, in different forms, in the households she'd managed, and the fix was always the same. You had to build structure that worked independently of any particular person. You had to make the system the reliable thing, not the person. She sat at the kitchen table that afternoon and wrote Dutch, his list, and then she wrote a second, longer document that laid out the domestic operation as she intended to run it. What would be done daily, what weekly, What needed to happen at the turn of each month? Who would be responsible for what? She didn't consult anyone. She wrote what made sense based on what she'd seen, and where she didn't have enough information, she left a note to gather it. She left Dutch's list on the kitchen table where he'd find it. His response came the following morning, delivered by Nell, who handed her a folded piece of paper with the solemnity of a diplomatic courier. Vivian unfolded it. Dutch had written, "Most of this is right. 2 items I'd push back on: the feed storage rotation and the smokehouse schedule. Come find me when you have time." She went and found him. But Dutch Alderman was not a man who wasted conversation. He stood by the fence of the near paddock with his arms crossed and listened to her talk through the smokehouse issue. And then he talked through the feed rotation with the patience of someone explaining something technical to a person he suspected might actually understand it, which was different from how he explained things to people he had concluded were not going to understand. "The rotation I've been running makes sense in summer," she said. "In winter, with this much livestock, you're cycling feed through the secondary shed too slowly, and the outer supply is degrading before it gets used." "That's what I was going to tell you," Dutch said, "except I was going to tell you the other way around." She looked at him. "Which of us is right?" He was quiet for a second. "Probably you," he said. "I've been running it the same way for 6 years, and I'll admit I haven't looked hard at whether it still makes sense." "I'll admit I might be wrong about the smokehouse schedule," she said. "I was working from the condition of the seals, but I don't know this equipment. If you've got a reason for the current timing is what it is because nobody's thought about it in 3 years. He uncrossed his arms. "You're probably right about the seals." They stood there for a moment in the cold. "I'm not trying to step on your operation," she said. "I know it," Dutch said. "The house isn't my operation anyway. I manage the land and the men, and I've been trying to manage the house because there was nobody else, and it's shown." "Yes," she said. "It has." He made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "You don't sugarcoat much." "I found it doesn't help." "Gideon's the same way." He looked out at the paddock. "Took me about 2 years to not find it aggravating." "Should I expect 2 years?" "Probably 6 months in your case." He picked up the fence rail he'd been working on when she arrived. "I'll adjust the feed rotation." But the first real resistance came from a hand named Roy Bassett. Roy was 38, had been with the Hartwell operation for 4 years, and operated under the impression, not entirely unjustified by the evidence of the previous household management, that the domestic side of the ranch was a loosely governed territory where the normal rules of the operation didn't apply with much force. He was not mean, exactly, but he was careless in the way of a person who has learned that carelessness doesn't cost him anything. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday morning looking for something to eat at 10 o'clock, outside of any scheduled meal, and when Vivian told him the kitchen wasn't open until noon, he looked at her with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he considered temporary. "I've always been able to come in and get something," he said. "I understand that," she said. "That's going to change. Meals at 6, noon, and 6 in the evening. The kitchen will have biscuits and coffee available from 5:30 until 7 in the morning for early starts. Outside of that, the kitchen is a working space and I need it clear." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to tell 23 men they can't get food when they're hungry?" "I'm going to tell 23 men when the kitchen operates and why," she said. "And then I'm going to follow through on it so they understand I mean what I say." "Gideon hasn't said anything about this." "Gideon hired me to manage the household," she said. "If you'd like to discuss it with him, his office is at the front of the house." Roy's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who wasn't accustomed to being handed back his own leverage. He looked at her for another second, then turned and walked out. She heard 2 days later from Nell that he'd gone to Dutch rather than Gideon, and that Dutch had told him, with apparently minimal elaboration, that the new arrangement stood and he should get used to it. Roy had not come back to the kitchen outside of scheduled hours since. He was not warm toward her, and she didn't expect him to be. What she needed was compliance, not warmth. And compliance she had. There were smaller frictions, the accumulated small resistances of a group of people who had organized themselves around an absence and now had to reorganize around a presence. She handled them one at a time, calmly, without drama or ultimatum, unless drama or ultimatum was specifically required. She was consistent, which she had learned was more important than being liked. People could work well with someone they didn't particularly like if that person was consistent. What they couldn't work with was unpredictability, because unpredictability made every interaction a small gamble, and that was exhausting over time. The meals improved, and that helped. Whatever reservations the men had about the new regime, they were eating significantly better than they had been in October, and that carried weight in a bunkhouse culture more efficiently than almost anything else could. She and Gideon talked at breakfast, which had become the daily working meeting of their arrangement without either of them formally proposing it as such. He would appear at 6:15, she would already have coffee made, and they would cover whatever needed covering: the household accounts, the ordering, occasional questions about the operation that touched on both their domains, and then the day would proceed. She found him, in these conversations, to be exactly what he'd presented himself as being at the auction: direct, practical, and operating under assumptions that were sometimes wrong in ways he wasn't aware of. The last part was the interesting one. He wasn't arrogant. Arrogance was a different thing, and she'd had enough experience with it to know the difference. But he had spent 20 years building something largely alone, which meant he had 20 years of unchallenged thinking about how things should work, and some of that thinking had calcified into certainty where it should have remained open. She pushed on those places carefully. Not to win arguments, she had no interest in winning arguments as an end in itself, but because the wrong assumptions cost money and time and sometimes people, and that mattered to her. "The hay order you put in last month," she said one February morning, "you're ordering the same volume as last year." "Same as every year," he said, not looking up from the ledger he'd brought to the table. "You've got 12 more head than last year." He looked up. "Where did you get that number?" "Dutch's count from January. I asked him for it when I was working out the supply projections." She poured her own coffee. "If the hay order stays the same, you'll be short in April, which is the worst possible month to be looking for additional supply because everyone else is in the same situation." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the calculation. "You're right," he said. "I'll send an amended order today." "I'd add 20% on top of what the calculation says," she said, "because calculations are based on normal conditions, and this winter's been dry, which means spring pasture recovery will be slower." He looked at her. "Dutch tell you that too?" "Dutch told me the winter. I read about spring pasture recovery in a book." "What book?" "One I borrowed from your office. I hope that's all right." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "What else are you reading from my office?" "Whatever seems useful," she said. "If there's something you'd prefer I not touch, tell me." "There's not," he said. And then, after a pause that she thought might have been surprise working itself through him, "Take whatever you want." March brought the first real thaw, and with it a shift in the household's texture. The sense, not dramatic, not announced, but real, of something having settled. The systems she'd put in place were running. The men had adjusted. The kitchen produced food that people were talking about at the feed store in Calhoun Flats, which she knew because Nell had heard it from the blacksmith's wife and reported it with a degree of pride that surprised Vivian and then, on reflection, didn't. She had also, quietly and without making an event of it, reorganized the ranch's domestic accounts in a way that reduced expenditure by roughly a fifth while improving the quality of what the money was producing. She presented the numbers to Gideon on a Thursday evening after supper, setting the ledger in front of him with the columns clearly marked. He studied it for a long time. She sat across the table and waited. "How did you do this?" he said. "Waste reduction primarily. Your previous ordering was buying things in quantities that didn't match consumption patterns, so you were constantly throwing out degraded supplies and reordering. I matched the order volumes to the actual usage." She leaned forward slightly and pointed to a column. "This is where the salt pork was going. You were ordering enough for 35 men and feeding 23, and the surplus was going bad in the smokehouse. Why was anyone ordering for 35? Because at some point you had 35 men, and the order got established, and no one revisited it." She leaned back. "That's the pattern across almost everything. The operation scaled up and then leveled off, but the orders were set during the scale-up and stayed there." He closed the ledger and looked at her. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the range had burned down to coals and gave the room a low, amber-colored light that made it feel smaller than it was. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited, because she didn't know what the apology was for. "I had a particular idea of what this arrangement would look like," he said, "and it was smaller than what you've done. I was thinking about, A well-run house, meals on time, accounts kept. I wasn't thinking... He stopped. I wasn't thinking of a partner. And you've been acting as one since you arrived, and I haven't acknowledged that. The word partner sat between them for a moment. You acknowledged it by not standing in the way, she said. That's the main thing. That's a low bar. It's a more common failure than you might think. He looked at the ledger and then at his hands and then at her. He was not a man who spoke easily about things that mattered to him. She'd understood that within a week. And the effort it cost him to say what he just said was visible in the way he held himself, like a man carrying something at an uncomfortable angle. I mean it, he said. This is not what I expected. What did you expect? He was honest about it, which she appreciated. Someone who would make the house livable and leave me alone to run the ranch. And instead someone who reads my books and fixes my ordering and makes my foreman adjust a 6-year-old feed rotation in the first week. A pause. I'm not complaining. Good, she said, because I'm not going to change. I know that. And the small sound he made then was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family of things. It was Dutch who first suggested, with characteristic economy of expression, that the horse situation was an opportunity being left on the table. The Hartwell operation ran cattle as its primary business and kept horses as working stock, which was standard. But the horses Gideon had were not standard working stock. He had, over 15 years of careful attention and instinct that wasn't always fully conscious of itself, assembled a small group of broodmares and a stallion of exceptional quality. An animal named Cato, dark bay, compact and deep-chested, with the particular intelligence behind the eye that serious horsemen spent years looking for and sometimes never found. You're breeding some of the finest animals in the territory, Dutch said one evening, sitting on the porch with Gideon, and selling them at working stock prices because you've never put yourself in the market as a breeder. I'm a cattle operation, Gideon said. You're a cattle operation that keeps producing horses that cattle operations twice your size are asking about. Dutch looked out at the dark paddock. I'm not saying abandon the cattle. I'm saying there's a separate business sitting right there, and you've been treating it like a hobby. Gideon didn't respond immediately, which was how he handled things he was actually thinking about versus things he'd already decided. 2 days later, he brought it to the breakfast table. Dutch thinks I should formalize the breeding program, he said. Put together a proper operation, advertise in the regional papers, price the animals at what they're actually worth. Vivian poured coffee. What do you think? I think he's probably right, and I've been reluctant to pursue it because it would require time and attention I haven't had. Have it now? He looked at her. I would if the household weren't... He stopped. Yes, he said. I do. Then let's look at the numbers, she said. She got up and went to the shelf where she'd been keeping the account ledgers and came back with the one that covered the stock operations. What are you currently getting per horse? 20 to 30. Depending on the animal. And what's the market for a well-documented breeding line in Nebraska right now? I don't know. Then that's the first thing to find out. She opened the ledger. Because I suspect the gap between what you're charging and what you could charge is significant, and before we build any kind of formal program, we need to know what the ceiling actually is. He watched her open the ledger and then he reached across and turned it so he could read it alongside her. And they sat like that at the breakfast table in the early light, working through the numbers together. And it was the most natural thing. Not because they had become easy with each other exactly, because there was still the specific tension of two people who are not fully known to each other yet, but because they had established the habit of working, and the working had made a space that felt, if not like home, then like something you could imagine becoming home. It was April when the thing she hadn't allowed herself to think about became impossible to ignore. She had been tired in a different way than the tiredness of hard work, which she knew well. This was a tiredness that started from somewhere deeper and moved outward, and it came with a particular kind of morning unease that she recognized, because she had experienced something like it once before, 7 years ago, in the early weeks of her first marriage, and then it had gone, and taken with it something she had permitted herself briefly to hope for, and after that the doctors had said what they said, and she had adjusted accordingly. She sat with the knowledge for a week before she let herself believe it enough to do anything with it. Then she went into Calhoun Flats on a supply run and stopped at the office of the town's physician, a man named Dr. Emmett Briggs, who was 60 years old and had the blunt manner of a man who believed people deserved accurate information more than they deserved comfortable ones. She told him what she was experiencing. He examined her with professional efficiency and asked questions, and then sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she read, imperfectly, as a man confronting something that didn't fit neatly into what he knew. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. She was using the name now, for legal purposes, if nothing else. "When were you told you were barren?" "Twice. The first time in 1895, the second in 1898. "By whom?" She told him. He nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing information and forming a conclusion at the same time. "I'm not going to tell you what I think those assessments were based on," he said, "because I don't know. What I can tell you is what I'm seeing now." He paused. "You are approximately 10 weeks along. The pregnancy appears to be progressing normally. Beyond that, I'm not in a position to make promises, because no one is ever in a position to make promises about these things, and I think you know that." She sat in his office chair for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the window and lay across the desk, and she looked at it. "I know that," she said. She drove back to the ranch with the supply wagon, and the knowledge sitting in her chest like something that didn't quite have a name yet. Not happiness. It was too uncertain, and too new, and too loaded with the memory of the last time to be simple happiness. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that. Something more complicated. Something that required time to become whatever it was going to be. That evening, after supper, she asked Gideon to stay at the table after the dishes were cleared and the kitchen had emptied. He stayed. He looked at her and waited, because he'd learned that she said things when she was ready, and pressing her before that point produced nothing useful. "I went to see Dr. Briggs today," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She folded her hands on the table. "I went because there's something I needed to know." She looked at him directly. "I'm pregnant." The word landed in the kitchen. Gideon sat very still for a long moment, and she watched the information move through him. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but she could see it. The quiet, seismic quality of a fact restructuring itself inside someone who has been operating for a long time without expecting it. "You told me the doctor said—" he started. "They did. I'm telling you what Dr. Briggs said today." He looked at the table, then at her. "How far?" "About 10 weeks. He put his hands flat on the table and then he took them off again, and she could see that he didn't know what to do with his hands, any more than he'd known what to do with them outside the feed store in February, standing in the cold, making an offer he hadn't fully worked out yet. "Vivian," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name without framing it in anything else, just the name, and the way he said it was not a question exactly. "I know," she said. "I know what you were told about me, and I know this is—" She stopped. "I'm not sure what this is yet. I needed you to know." He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the wind picking up outside. "All right," he said eventually. The same word from the first night, the same quality of a man who has accepted information and decided to proceed with it. But there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there at the auction or outside the feed store or even at the breakfast table working through the ledger together. He stood up slowly, and he did something she did not expect. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, an unpracticed gesture, slightly awkward, the physical expression of someone who doesn't do this often, but has decided to do it now. And then he took his hand back and said he needed to check on the horses and walked out the back. She sat at the table alone for a moment. She heard the back door close, and then through the window she saw the shape of him crossing the dark yard toward the paddock, and she understood that he had gone somewhere private to feel something he hadn't expected to be feeling, and she found that she respected him for knowing, at least that he needed to. She got up and began banking the fire for the night. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, and she let herself hold, very carefully, like something that might break if she held it carelessly. The possibility that the life she was building in this cold and practical and unlikely place might turn out to contain things she had given up expecting. Not certainty. She was too old and had been through too much for certainty. But possibility. Real possibility. The kind that comes not from luck or from wishing, but from two people doing the actual work of building something together, day after day, in all the ordinary light of ordinary mornings. That was what she had, and she chose, as she had always chosen, to work with what she had. She closed the damper on the range and listened to the night wind press against the house. The same wind as that first night, indifferent and enormous. And this time, it sounded slightly different, not warmer. The Nebraska wind was never warm, but less opposed somehow, like something that was simply there, the way difficult things simply are, while you get on with everything else. The boy was born on a Tuesday in late November, during a sleet storm that came off the plains without warning and turned the ranch yard into a gray sheet of ice before anyone had finished breakfast. His name was Thomas. They had agreed on it sometime in August, sitting on the porch in the evening heat, not making a ceremony of the conversation. Gideon had said it was his father's name, and Vivian had said it was a good name, plain and solid, and that had been the end of it. Thomas Hartwell. He arrived in the world at 11 in the morning, delivered by Dr. Briggs, who had driven out from Calhoun Flats through worsening weather, with the stoic efficiency of a man who had been making this drive in bad conditions for 30 years and had stopped being resentful about it. He was healthy. Vivian was exhausted, but intact, which was more than she'd let herself assume during the final weeks when the weight of everything she'd been told by 2 different doctors in 2 different decades had pressed on her in the dark hours of early morning when there was nothing to do but lie still and wait. Gideon stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Dutch was somewhere below. She could hear the low register of his voice talking to Sully or one of the other hands. Nell had been up most of the night and was now asleep in the chair by the window, her head tilted at an angle that would hurt her neck by the time she woke. "He's got your hands," Gideon said finally. Vivian looked down at the small fists. "He's got enormous hands," she said. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is where I come from." She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway still, not quite entering, the way he did sometimes with things he wasn't sure he had the right to approach too closely. It was one of his patterns, this particular hesitation at the threshold of things that mattered to him. She had come to recognize it. "Come in," she said. "He's yours too." He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms with the practical care of someone handing over something irreplaceable. And she watched Gideon's face do something she had not yet seen it do in the 9 months she'd known him. Not soften exactly, that was the wrong word for what happened, but open, in the way that a thing opens when the pressure that has been holding it closed for a very long time is finally, temporarily released. "Thomas," he said quietly. The baby's eyes were closed. He was oblivious to the sleet and the man holding him and the particular weight of the moment. He was simply present, warm and breathing and new, which was all he needed to be. The rumors started in January. She heard them the way you hear most rumors in a small county, sideways through a third party who is telling you not to repeat it while clearly expecting you to. It was Nell who told her, standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has been carrying something uncomfortable and has decided that carrying it alone is worse than saying it out loud. "People in town are saying things," Nell said, "about Thomas." Vivian kept her hands in the bread dough. "What things?" "That Mr. Hartwell isn't—" Nell stopped, her face going red. "That you were already carrying when you came to the exchange." Vivian worked the dough for another turn. "Who's saying it?" "I heard it from Margaret Crane, Purvis Crane's wife. She said she heard it from Dorothea Ames, who got it from—" Nell shook her head. "I don't know how far back it goes, but it's going around." "What else are they saying?" Nell hesitated. "That you lied about being Barren to make yourself seem, I don't know, less threatening, so Mr. Hartwell would take pity on you, and that you had a relationship before in Kearney, and that's enough," Vivian said. Not sharply, just as a fact. She finished the bread and set it to rise and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the January yard, where the cold had locked everything into stillness and the sky was the color of old iron. She thought about the arithmetic of it. Thomas born in late November, 9 months after February, which was when anyone paying attention to the calendar could have worked out the timeline. The timeline was correct. The accusation was not. But timelines required people to do arithmetic, and most people preferred a story. And a story about a desperate woman deceiving a wealthy man was more interesting and more satisfying to certain kinds of minds than the unremarkable truth, which was that 2 people had made a practical arrangement that had, slowly and with considerable difficulty, become something more. She went and found Gideon in his office. "Have you heard the talk?" she said. He was at his desk, going over the breeding records he'd been building since fall. He looked up. "About Thomas." It wasn't a question. "Yes. Halsey Drummond said something to me at the feed cooperative last week." His voice was careful, the specific careful of a man who is managing his own anger. "I told him the timeline was what it was, and he could do the mathematics himself." "Did that satisfy him?" "No, but what I told him next did." He paused. "I'm not particularly concerned with what Halsey Drummond believes." "I know," she said. "But it's not just Drummond." She sat down in the chair across from his desk. "It's spreading, and it's going to keep spreading unless it meets something solid." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that ignoring it doesn't stop it. Ignoring a thing like this doesn't make it go away. It makes it grow because there's nothing to push against." She looked at him steadily. "I want to go to town." He put down his pen. "Go to town and do what?" "Go to town and be visible. Go to the events. Talk to people. Let them form an opinion of me that's based on me rather than on whatever's being passed around the Ames parlor." She paused. "I know how this works, Gideon. The only way to change what people think is to give them something real to replace it with." He was quiet for a moment. "You shouldn't have to do this." "I know I shouldn't have to." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you what I intend to do anyway." He looked at her for a moment more, and then he nodded once. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He picked up his pen again. "Saturday, then. There's a meeting of the County Improvement Association. We'll go to that." The meeting of the Millard County Improvement Association was held in the Calhoun Flats Town Hall, a two-story building on the main street with a pot-bellied stove in the corner that heated the room unevenly, leaving the front warm and the back drafty. About 40 people attended: farmers, merchants, their wives. The kind of community turnout that suggested the meeting was partly genuine civic concern and partly a social occasion dressed up in practical clothing. Vivian went in wearing her good wool dress, the dark blue one she'd bought in November with part of the housekeeping savings, and she carried Thomas, who was 2 months old and had reached the stage of looking around at everything with a wide, serious attention that strangers found disarming. She watched the room shift when she walked in. Not dramatically. No one said anything. No one made a scene. But there was a particular recalibration in the way eyes moved across her, the specific type of attention that means an audience has been anticipating a performance and is now trying to decide if it's going to get one. She gave them something better than a performance. She gave them herself. She sat with Gideon near the front, because that was where you sat if you intended to be seen. She spoke when she was asked to. The meeting's agenda included a discussion of county road maintenance, about which she had formed a specific opinion based on the difficulty of getting the supply wagon through the northern route in early spring. And she spoke clearly and with the kind of practical specificity that made it difficult to dismiss what she was saying as unserious. Afterward, in the general mingling that followed, she made a point of speaking to people she didn't know. Not aggressively. She didn't introduce herself with the energy of someone trying to prove something, but with the ordinary warmth of a person who is genuinely interested in what others have to say and is willing to let that interest show. Dorothea Ames approached her near the stove. Dorothea was 60, the wife of a county commissioner, and had the self-possession of a woman who had been the social arbiter of a small community for long enough to have forgotten what it felt like to be uncertain of her own authority. She looked at Thomas first, in that way people look at babies when they're doing arithmetic, and then she looked at Vivian. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "I don't believe we've met properly." "We haven't," Vivian agreed. "I've been glad of the chance. The baby is well?" "Very well, thank you." Dorothea's eyes moved over her with a thoroughness that was barely disguised as pleasantness. "You've settled into ranch life quickly, it seems." "I had experience," Vivian said, "and Gideon's household was... there was room for improvement." She said it simply, without self-congratulation, and she saw the slight flicker in Dorothea's expression that meant the straightforwardness had registered. "I heard you were from Kearney. Before that, Hastings." She shifted Thomas to her other arm. He looked at Dorothea with his serious dark eyes. "I was George Cross's wife. He passed in 1895. I was Emmett Porter's wife after that." She said the second name without elaborating, and she watched Dorothea try to read the space around it. Then the exchange, then here. The directness of it clearly unsettled Dorothea slightly. She'd expected deflection, or perhaps a performance of shame, and had gotten instead a plain accounting of facts that left nothing for the rumor to grip. "Well," she said, "it seems you've landed in a good situation." "I've built one," Vivian said. "There's a difference." Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Then the older woman did something that Vivian had not fully predicted. She smiled briefly, the smile of a woman who has spent 60 years in a world that is largely run by men and recognizes, perhaps against her better social judgment, something familiar in the answer she's just received. "Indeed there is," Dorothea said. She touched Thomas on the cheek once with one finger. "He looks like a Hartwell." "He has enormous hands," Vivian said. Dorothea laughed. It was a real laugh, short and a little surprised, and it was the most useful thing that happened that evening, because 3 people nearby heard it, and in a small community, a woman like Dorothea Ames laughing with the woman everyone had been talking about was a form of public communication that no speech could replicate. The rumors didn't disappear overnight. They thinned out, the way things do when they encounter consistent reality and run out of oxygen. By March, they had become the kind of thing that was still said occasionally in certain households, but was no longer said freely, because freely said things require an audience that's receptive, and the audience had begun to drift. What replaced the rumors was something Vivian had not engineered but had perhaps cleared the ground for, a more accurate understanding of what was happening at the Hartwell Ranch, which was that a capable woman was running a domestic operation efficiently, and a new horse breeding program was producing animals that people with money were willing to travel to see. The breeding program had taken shape over the fall and winter in the specific way that things take shape when 2 people with complementary skills are working on the same problem. Gideon knew the horses, knew their bloodlines and their temperaments, and the particular qualities that made a working animal exceptional rather than merely adequate. Vivian knew the business side, the record-keeping, the correspondence with potential buyers, the pricing structure, the way you presented a product to a market that didn't yet know it wanted it. They had their first significant outside sale in February. A rancher from Colorado who had heard about Cato's offspring through a contact in Omaha and had driven 3 days to see for himself. His name was Aldous Fitch, and he was a practical man who knew horses the way men know things when their livelihood depends on that knowledge. He walked the paddock for 2 hours, asked questions that were intelligent and specific, and then offered a price for 2 of the yearlings that was nearly twice what Gideon had been charging. Gideon had started to answer, and Vivian had said, "We appreciate the offer. We'll need until tomorrow morning." Fitch had looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating who he was negotiating with. "Tomorrow morning, then," he said. That evening, she and Gideon had gone through the numbers. "He'll go higher," she said. "He drove 3 days. He's not going to drive 3 days and come away empty." "You think so?" "I know so. A man who drives 3 days for something has already decided he wants it. The price he opened with wasn't his ceiling. It was his starting position." She had the ledger open on the table. "If we come back with a counter 15% above his offer, he'll meet us somewhere in the middle, and the middle is better than what he opened with." "You've done this before," Gideon said. "Not a question. I watched my first husband negotiate grain prices for 7 years," she said. "He was a poor negotiator. You learn more from watching someone do something badly than from watching someone do it well." The next morning, she let Gideon handle the counter because Fitch was from a particular generation of man for whom being negotiated with by a woman was still a disruption to the natural order, and the disruption would cost them money. Gideon named the price. Fitch said nothing for a moment, then said he'd go 10% above his opening offer. Gideon said 12. Fitch said 11, and they shook hands, and the 2 yearlings left for Colorado at a price that made the horse program, in that single sale, profitable for the quarter. Afterward, when Fitch's wagon had gone, Gideon said, "You knew he'd settle at 11. "I thought he would," she said. "You can't know these things. You can only read them." "You read 'em right. This time." She went inside because Thomas would need feeding, and there was bread that needed to come out of the oven, and the account ledger for the sale needed to be updated before she forgot the specifics. She had learned in 9 months that there was always another thing that needed doing, and that this was not a burden so much as it was simply the character of a life that was full. She had not always had a full life, and she preferred it to the alternative. The legal trouble arrived in June, the way serious trouble often arrives, on a pleasant day without much warning, in the form of a polite document that concealed its intentions inside formal language. The document was a complaint filed in county court by a man named Edgar Voss. Voss was a land speculator who operated out of Omaha and had been, for the previous 2 years, acquiring properties along the river corridor north of Calhoun Flats, buying distressed farms cheap, consolidating parcels, and positioning himself for what was widely understood to be a pending railway extension that would make the corridor significantly more valuable. He was not from Nebraska and didn't pretend to understand it the way the people who'd grown up there understood it, but he understood land values and leverage and the particular opportunities that opened up when people were stretched thin and desperate. The complaint alleged that a portion of the Hartwell operation's grazing land, 43 acres along the northern boundary, was improperly titled and had been so since Gideon's original purchase of the property in 1884. Voss claimed a prior interest through a chain of title that traced back to an 1879 territorial grant that had, according to his documentation, never been properly extinguished. It was a sophisticated claim. Vivian read the document 3 times on the afternoon it arrived, and then read it again that evening after Thomas was asleep, because the sophistication of it was worth understanding carefully. It wasn't a simple fraud, or at least it wasn't simple to expose as one, which was the more important point. The documentation Voss had filed was real documentation. The chain of title he was citing existed. What was debatable, and what would need to be demonstrated in court, was whether his interpretation of the 1879 grant was accurate, or whether the subsequent territorial transfers that had occurred before Nebraska statehood had properly extinguished whatever interest that grant created. Gideon's reaction to the document was controlled fury, which was how he expressed most of his stronger emotions. Everything compressed inward rather than released outward, so that what you saw was not the anger itself, but the edges of it, the specific stillness of a man holding something down. 43 acres, he said. I've been running cattle on that land for 18 years. I know, Vivian said. This is about the railway. Yes. If the northern corridor increases in value, that parcel becomes worth considerably more than it is now. She set down the document. He's not interested in the 43 acres. He's interested in what they'll sell for when the rail comes through. Then he can be interested in them from across the county, Gideon said, because he's not getting them. We need a lawyer, she said, not just any lawyer, someone who knows territorial land law specifically. There's Thaddeus Cray in Lincoln. I know the name. Is he competent? He's the best in the state. Get him, she said, and I need to see all the original title documents from the 1884 purchase. Everything, not just the summary, the actual documents. He looked at her. You're going to read them. I read everything, she said. That's not going to change. What? Thaddeus Cray came out from Lincoln on a Thursday in late June, a small, thin man of about 50 with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular sharpness of someone whose entire professional life had been spent reading documents that other people found impenetrable and finding the things inside them that mattered. He sat at the dining room table with the documents spread around him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and he did not speak for the first hour. Vivian sat across from him with her own copy of Voss's filing, which she had annotated in pencil. When Cray finally looked up, his gaze went to her first, which she noted. You've read the complaint. Several times. What do you make of it? She turned to the page she'd marked. His chain of title is real, but his interpretation of the 1879 grant is aggressive. The grant specified grazing rights, not fee ownership, which is a significant distinction. And there's a recorded instrument from 1881, here, she pointed, that I think constitutes a formal extinguishment of whatever interest the 1879 grant created, even if it doesn't use that specific language. Cray looked at the page she was pointing to. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that his client is more prepared than he expected. You have a legal background, Mrs. Hartwell? No, she said. I have a reading habit and a logical mind. The 1881 instrument is exactly what I was going to raise with you. He leaned back slightly. You're correct that it's central. The question is whether the court reads it as an extinguishment or as something narrower. What's Voss's strategy if we press on that point? He'll argue that the 1881 instrument was a partial conveyance only, and that the residual interest from 1879 survived it. Cray picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down. It's not a frivolous argument. It's wrong, but it's not frivolous. What does he want? Gideon said from his chair by the window. He'd been letting Vivian and Cray work through it, which was the right call and which she appreciated. He wants you to settle, Cray said. Pay him something for a quitclaim deed and make it go away. He knows litigation is expensive, and that most landowners in your position would rather pay a nuisance settlement than spend months fighting it in court. I'm not paying him anything, Gideon said. No, Vivian said, but we should understand what he'll do when we don't. She looked at Cray. If we refuse to settle, he takes this to court. What's the timeline? 6 to 8 months to trial, maybe longer. And in the meantime, he'll file for a temporary injunction restricting use of the disputed parcel. She'd expected that. Can he get it? He can try. He won't get a full injunction, but he might get a partial one, which would still disrupt your grazing rotation. Cray looked at his papers. He's also, and I want to be direct with you about this, he's also spoken to several people in the county who have expressed an interest in testifying to certain things about the provenance of your original title documents. The room was quiet for a moment. Meaning he's found people willing to lie, Vivian said. Meaning he's found people with financial interests that align with his preferred outcome, Cray said carefully. Which amounts to the same thing, but can be more difficult to demonstrate in court. Gideon's jaw had tightened. Vivian looked at Cray steadily. Who? I'd rather not say until I've confirmed it. Say anyway. Cray hesitated. Halsey Drummond, and a man named Roy Bassett, who I understand was formerly employed, is still employed, Gideon said. His voice had gone flat and very quiet. He's still on the payroll. He may not be, Vivian said. She held Gideon's gaze for a moment. We'll deal with that separately. After Cray had left, she sat at the dining room table with the documents still spread around her and the specific heaviness of having seen the whole shape of something land in front of you at once. Bassett's involvement was not a complete surprise. She had known since the kitchen confrontation 9 months ago that his resentment had gone somewhere, and resentment with nowhere to go tends to find a buyer eventually. Drummond she had underestimated, which was her error, and she accepted it as such. What she hadn't underestimated was the nature of men like Voss, who were common enough in a certain era of land speculation, capable, methodical, and completely comfortable treating other people's lives and property as variables in a financial calculation. She had seen the type before, though never aimed directly at her. She picked up Cray's card and turned it over in her fingers. Then she picked up her pencil and turned to a fresh page of the ledger she used for notes, and she began writing out the structure of the problem. What was legal, what was personal, what could be handled in court, and what needed to be handled before court made it worse. The hearing on Voss's injunction was set for September. She had 3 months to understand the matter better than anyone in that courtroom, and that was what she intended to do. She wrote to 2 land offices requesting the original territorial records from 1879 and 1881. She corresponded with a woman in Lincoln named Helen Marsh, no relation to Gideon's first wife, just a coincidence of names, who had worked as a legal secretary for 15 years and had an encyclopedic familiarity with territorial-era land grants that she was willing to share for a modest consulting fee with people who presented their questions clearly and honestly. Vivian presented her questions clearly and honestly, and the resulting correspondence was worth considerably more than the fee. What she found, across 6 weeks of reading, was that Voss's chain of title had a weakness he hadn't anticipated she would find, because most ranch wives in 1902 Nebraska were not spending their evenings with territorial grant records and land office correspondence from the 1870s. The 1879 grant had been issued under a provision of territorial law that required annual registration to remain valid, a provision that was easily overlooked and frequently was, but that had been included in the original grant document in language that was unambiguous to anyone reading it closely. The prior holder of the interest had registered in 1879 and 1880 and then stopped, which meant the interest had lapsed under its own terms in 1881 before the conveyance that Voss was citing as the basis of his claim. The 1881 extinguishment instrument that she'd pointed out to Cray on his first visit was therefore even more powerful than she'd initially understood, It wasn't extinguishing a valid interest, it was recording the lapse of one that had already expired. Voss's entire chain of title was built on a claim that had ceased to exist 22 years earlier. She presented this to Cray in August, in a letter she spent 3 evenings writing, with the relevant documents attached, and the argument laid out in a sequence that she hoped a court would find impossible to misread. Cray's response arrived 4 days later. Mrs. Hartwell, this is correct, and it is dispositive. I don't believe we will need to go to trial. He was right. Voss's lawyers, presented with the evidence in advance of the September hearing, requested 2 weeks to review it. At the end of those 2 weeks, they withdrew the complaint. There was no ceremony to it. A document arrived, Cray sent word, and that was that. Gideon read Cray's letter at the breakfast table and then set it down and looked at Vivian, who was cutting bread. It's done, he said. Yes. How did you find the registration provision? I read everything, she said, which was the same thing she'd told him she was going to do in June, and which she supposed would remain her answer for as long as he continued to be surprised by it. He was quiet for a moment. Bassett's leaving at the end of the week, he said. I know, Dutch told me. I should have... You handled it when you knew, she said. That's what you can do. She set the bread on the table. Roy Bassett made his choices. We don't have to spend too much time on them. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. There was something in his face that she had learned to read over the past months, a specific quality of the way he looked at her when he was revising his understanding of something, when the person in front of him was resolving into a clearer shape than the one he'd been carrying. She had come to find this look, careful, almost reluctant, as if the revision cost him something, more honest and more meaningful than any easier expression would have been. The court date was September, she said. We should still go. He frowned slightly. The case was withdrawn. The case was withdrawn, but Voss's relationship to the county hasn't changed, and neither has ours. She sat down. There will be another version of this eventually, from him or from someone like him. The best answer to that is letting the county see us. In the courthouse, in the public record, as people who fight and win. She looked at him. Not because we're powerful, because we're right, and we're prepared and we don't settle when we're right. He was quiet for another moment. You want to go to the courthouse on our court date, he said, even though there's nothing to hear. I want to walk into that building on a morning when the county is watching, she said, and I want to walk out again. That's what I want. He looked at her. Then he picked up a piece of the bread. September 3rd, he said. We'll need to leave early. I know, she said. I'll have the wagon ready. Outside, Thomas had begun making the sounds that meant he was awake in the other room, the insistent and surprisingly loud protests of a 7-month-old who has decided that everyone in his vicinity should be aware of his existence. In a moment, Nell would get him, and the morning would move into its ordinary rhythm. The ranch would do what it did. The horses in the south paddock would move in the early light. Dutch would appear at the fence with his arms crossed and his geological patience, and the day would proceed, full and difficult and real, the way all the days had been since a February morning when the wagon had pulled out of Calhoun Flats and the feed store had gotten small behind them. Vivian poured herself coffee and listened to her son announce himself to the morning, and she thought, not for the first time, and with the same careful, unglamorous hope she applied to most things she valued, that they were going to be all right, not because anything was finished, nothing was ever finished, but because she knew now, with the particular certainty of someone who has tested a thing from multiple directions and found it solid, that what they had built here was not luck, and not performance, and not the goodwill of a community that had done nothing to earn that goodwill before she'd come and done the work. It was hers and Gideon's, built from nothing more extraordinary than intelligence and stubbornness and the daily willingness to do the actual work. That was enough. That she had learned, always been enough. The second child was a girl. They named her Margaret, not after anyone in particular, just a name that Vivian had always thought sounded like someone who knew her own mind. She arrived in the spring of 1904, 14 months after Thomas, and her arrival was harder than his had been in ways that Dr. Briggs did not fully explain until afterward, when the immediate danger had passed, and he had the composed manner of a man who has been very frightened and is now permitting himself to be relieved. The labor had gone wrong in the final hours. There was bleeding that shouldn't have happened at the rate it did, and a period of about 40 minutes. Gideon was told this later because he had been kept out of the room and had spent those 40 minutes sitting at the bottom of the stairs with his hands between his knees, which was the closest to prayer he had ever come, during which Briggs had been genuinely uncertain whether he would be delivering a child into a household that still had its mother. Vivian survived it. Margaret arrived healthy and loud, which was the first sign that she was going to be exactly the kind of person she turned out to be. But the aftermath left Vivian in bed for 3 weeks, which was the longest she had been still in the 2 years since she'd arrived at the ranch, and she found the stillness harder than any of the work had been. Not because she didn't need the rest, she did, her body made that undeniable, but because the work had become, without her entirely noticing when it happened, the structure around which she understood herself. Without it, there was too much time to think about what Briggs had said to Gideon, that another pregnancy would carry significant risk, that the circumstances of Margaret's birth had left some damage that healed but left its mark. Gideon told her this on the 4th day of her convalescence, sitting in the chair by her bed where Nell usually sat. He told it to her plainly, which she appreciated, though she could see that the plainness cost him. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He's sure?" He said significant risk. He wasn't more specific than that. That's a careful answer. It's what he said. Gideon looked at his hands. He said you should know, and that you should be the one to decide what to do with knowing it. She was quiet. Outside, Thomas, who was now 16 months old and had recently discovered that he could climb things he was not supposed to climb, was making a sound that indicated supervision was required. She heard Nell's voice, and then the sound subsided. "All right," she said. "That's all? That's all for now." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not sad about it, because I am. But I'm also not going to spend the next month in this bed being sad when there are 2 children who need a mother who is functional and present." She shifted against the pillow. "Hand me that ledger." "Vivian, the breeding ledger. It's on the desk." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not dying, Gideon. I'm convalescing. There's a difference, and the difference includes being allowed to use my mind." He got her the ledger. Did. The horse breeding program by 1905 had outgrown its original conception. What had begun as a practical response to Dutch's observation that exceptional animals were being sold at working stock prices had developed into something that Gideon had not fully anticipated when he and Vivian had sat at the breakfast table 3 years earlier working through the numbers. The Hartwell line, as it had come to be known in regional livestock circles, had a reputation that traveled faster than either of them had planned for. Cato's offspring were turning up in operations across Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado, and the quality was consistent enough that buyers were coming to the ranch rather than waiting for the ranch to come to them. By the middle of 1905, they had expanded the breeding program to include 4 stallions and a broodmare herd of 16, and Vivian had built a documentation system for the bloodlines that was detailed enough to be genuinely useful to serious buyers, not just the standard records of parentage and birth dates, but temperament notes, working assessments, training observations. She had started doing this because she thought it was the right way to represent what they were selling, and she had been right. Buyers who came looking for a horse left with a document that told them exactly what they'd bought and why, and they came back because of it. The record system also served a second purpose, which she hadn't initially planned for. It was a history, not a sentimental one. She had no patience for sentimentality about livestock, but a genuine account of what the Hartwell operation had built, animal by animal, decision by decision, over the years. She found herself occasionally reading back through the early entries from 1903 and 1904, when they'd had 6 broodmares and 1 stallion and were figuring out the pricing as they went. And there was something in the reading of it, not nostalgia exactly, but the specific satisfaction of being able to trace the distance between where a thing started and where it arrived. Gideon managed the horses and the cattle and the land with the same focused intensity he'd always brought to the operation, but there was a quality to his work in these years that was different from what Dutch described of the earlier decades, a loosening, barely perceptible, in the way he operated. He was still demanding. He still expected things to be done correctly and said so when they weren't. But he had stopped being, in the way Dutch had once characterized it, a man running his own operation on fear. He had started being, instead, something closer to a man who expected good work because he was doing good work himself and expected the same from people he respected. Dutch noticed it. He said so to Vivian one morning in the spring of 1905, with the economy of a man who does not distribute observations casually. "He's different," Dutch said. They were standing at the paddock fence watching two of the yearlings work the near field, and Dutch had the relaxed attention of a man in his element, and he said it without looking at her, as if the paddock were the audience and she was incidental. "Different how?" she said. "Quieter. Not less. I don't mean quieter about his opinions. Quieter inside somehow." He watched the yearlings. Like a man who has stopped waiting for the worst thing to happen. She thought about that. "Is that new?" "It's newer than you are," Dutch said, which was as close to a direct compliment as he had ever come in her presence, and she understood it as such and let it stand. Thomas, by the time he was 5, was following Gideon everywhere that Gideon would permit him to follow, and frequently into places he hadn't permitted. He was a serious child, not solemn because he had too much energy and too much curiosity for solemnity, but serious in the sense that he attended to things with a focus that was striking in someone so young. He watched the horses with the same quality of attention that Gideon brought to them, which was something Gideon noticed without commenting on directly, though Vivian saw him noticing. Margaret was entirely different, which pleased Vivian in a way she hadn't anticipated. Where Thomas was focused, Margaret was restless, moving from one thing to the next with a speed that was difficult to track, full of questions that didn't always want answers so much as more questions. She got into Vivian's account ledgers at 3 years old and made marks in them with a pencil stub she'd found somewhere. And when Vivian found her, she explained with considerable confidence that she was fixing the numbers. "They were wrong," Margaret said, looking up from the ledger with the expression of someone who has done a service and expects acknowledgement. "Those numbers represent real money," Vivian said. "I know, I made them bigger." Vivian looked at the page. The child had drawn large circles around several figures. "That's not how it works." "Why not?" It was, Vivian had to admit, a reasonable question about accounting in the abstract, and she sat down and explained it, and Margaret listened with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she considered genuinely interesting, which was distinguished clearly from the quality of attention she brought to things she found boring, which was characterized by looking in a different direction entirely. The third child, a boy they named Daniel, came in 1907, and Briggs delivered him with the particular care of a doctor who has not forgotten the circumstances of the previous delivery and is taking no unnecessary chances. It went better. Not easily. Nothing about Vivian's labors was easy, which she accepted as the particular tax her body seemed to levy on these occasions. But without the terrifying 40 minutes of the second time, and afterward Briggs told Gideon that he was cautiously satisfied, which was as positive as Briggs generally got. Daniel was the one who surprised them most. Quieter than either of his siblings, watchful in the way of a child who is absorbing everything before deciding what to say about any of it. He would sit on the porch for long stretches and observe the yard with an attention that was not passive. You could see it wasn't passive. There was something active happening behind the eyes. And when he finally spoke about what he'd been watching, it was usually to note something that no one else had noticed. At 4, he told Vivian that one of the broodmares in the south paddock was walking differently on her left front than she had the day before. Vivian had looked, and he was right, and the vet found a small stone bruise that, if left unattended, would have become a lameness issue within the week. "How did you see that?" she asked him. He thought about it. "She looked sad," he said finally. "Horses don't look sad." "This one did," he said, with the calm certainty of a person who is reporting an observation rather than offering an opinion, and she had looked at him for a long moment and decided not to argue. The years between 1905 and 1912 were the building years in the fullest sense of the term, not the initial construction, which had been Gideon's alone, but the building of something larger and more complicated, the kind that requires multiple people carrying different parts of it and trusting that the other parts are being held. The cattle operation remained the financial foundation, but the horse program had grown to the point where it constituted a serious secondary income, and Vivian had begun, around 1908, to correspond with several operations in neighboring states about a cooperative arrangement for bloodline documentation and shared breeding records. The idea was practical. A shared record system would allow buyers to make better informed decisions, which was good for everyone who was selling honest animals. And it was also forward-looking in a way that the purely individual operation wasn't. She saw that the future of quality livestock breeding would require information infrastructure, and she was building some of it. Gideon's initial reaction to the cooperative idea was skepticism. "We share our records with competing breeders," he said. "And then what? We help them sell horses?" "We help establish the Hartwell name as the standard that the records are built around," she said, "because the documentation system is ours, and everyone using it is using our framework." She pushed the draft proposal across the table. "Read it before you decide." He read it. He came back 2 days later and said, "Change the section about record access. Other operations shouldn't have full access to our temperament assessments. Those are the most labor-intensive part, and they give away what we know." "Agreed," she said. "I'll revise it." The cooperative agreement, signed by 7 operations across Nebraska and Kansas by 1910, was a modest thing by most measures, but a significant one in its specific world. It created a shared standard for documentation that improved the quality of buying decisions across the region and positioned the Hartwell line, as Vivian had intended, as the model that others were aligning to. She did not do any of this alone, and she didn't pretend to. Gideon's knowledge of the animals was irreplaceable. Dutch's operational experience was the backbone of the day-to-day management. A young woman named Clara Vance, no relation, again, just the name, who arrived in 1908 seeking work and turned out to have a gift for the correspondence work that Vivian's cooperative project required, became essential in ways that Vivian acknowledged directly and compensated accordingly, because she had strong feelings about acknowledging work and compensating it, and had learned early that the failure to do so was both unjust and practically stupid. But she was the one who had seen the shape of what was possible and had pressed toward it, and she knew that. And she did not minimize it to herself, even when it would have been easier or more comfortable to frame it as something that had just happened rather than something she had built. Thomas, at 10, decided he wanted to run the ranch. He announced this at the dinner table on a Wednesday evening with the composure of someone delivering a business proposal, and Gideon looked at him with an expression that contained multiple things at once: amusement and something careful underneath it, and something else that took Vivian a moment to identify as recognition. "That's the plan, is it?" Gideon said. "The horse program will need someone who understands the bloodlines," Thomas said. "I've been reading the records." "You've been reading the breeding records," Vivian said, "since last spring. You left them on the desk." "I leave things on the desk because they need to be returned to the shelf, not read. They were interesting." He said this without apology, which was a quality she'd given him and occasionally found inconvenient. "The Cato line is the strongest, but it's also getting narrow. If we keep breeding within it, we'll start getting conformational problems in the next generation." Gideon set down his fork. "Where did you read that?" "I didn't. I worked it out." Thomas said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting a calculation rather than showing off. The same bloodline contributing both sides of a cross produces predictable traits, but also predictable weaknesses. We need new blood from outside. There was a silence at the table. Margaret, who was 8 and found most dinner conversations insufficiently dramatic, was watching with the alert attention she reserved for situations that might become interesting. Daniel, 6, was eating and watching a moth on the ceiling lamp. Gideon looked at Vivian. She looked back at him with the expression she used when she was declining to rescue him from a conversation. "You're 10 years old," Gideon said to Thomas. "I know that," Thomas said patiently. "I'm not saying I should run it now. I'm saying I want to understand it well enough to run it later." "And the cattle?" "The cattle are steady income, but not the future." He said it with a certainty that was either precocious insight or 10-year-old overconfidence. And the difficult thing was that it was hard to tell which. The future is the breeding program. The market for quality horses is going to grow as the automobile grows, because people who can afford good horses are the same people who don't need a horse to get somewhere. The silence at the table was different now. "Where did you get that idea?" Vivian asked. "I heard you tell Mrs. Vance that 3 months ago," he said. "You were talking about the next decade of the cooperative." She had said that. She looked at her son for a moment. "You were listening." "I was in the next room." "Next time," she said, "come into the room." Margaret said loudly, "Can I be a doctor?" Everyone looked at her. "A what?" Gideon said. "A doctor. Like Dr. Briggs, but better." She said the last part with the casual confidence of someone who considers improvement over the existing standard obvious and desirable. He didn't know what was wrong with Mrs. Alderman's knee last winter, and I could tell from the way she walked. It's the same as how Daniel knew about the horse. Dutch's wife, Ellen Alderman, had in fact had a persistent knee problem that Briggs had diagnosed as general inflammation. Her knee had resolved, eventually, when someone had identified that she was compensating for an unevenness in her left boot sole that had developed over years. This was not something Briggs had discovered. It was something that Dutch's 12-year-old granddaughter had pointed out, which was, Margaret apparently knew, not the same as Margaret having pointed it out, but was apparently still informative. "Women don't become doctors," Gideon said. Not dismissively. He said it as a fact of the world as he understood it. "Some do," Vivian said. She looked at Margaret. "It's very difficult." "Difficult is different from impossible," Margaret said, which was something Vivian had said to her once and had apparently been retained with perfect fidelity. Daniel, without looking up from his plate, said, "I want to be fair." "Fair?" Gideon said. "I want things to be fair." He looked up briefly and then back at his food. "On the ranch, between people. I don't know what that's called." Vivian looked at her youngest for a moment. He was 6, compact and observant, with the patience of someone who understood that things moved at their own pace and that waiting was not the same as passivity. "A just person," she said. "That's what it's called." He nodded as if this was satisfactory and went back to eating. Done. Dutch retired in the spring of 1911, which he did not announce so much as simply declare, arriving at the breakfast table one morning and informing Gideon that he was done at the end of the month, and that he recommended a man named Carter Webb, who had been working the northern section for 3 years and was, in Dutch's assessment, the best available option. The retirement announcement lasted approximately 4 minutes, and was entirely characteristic of Dutch in its economy and its presumption that his conclusion on the matter of Carter Webb was the relevant one. Gideon accepted both the retirement and the recommendation without visible emotion, which was how he processed most things that mattered to him. That evening, after supper, Vivian found him on the front porch looking at the dark land with the specific quality of stillness he brought to thoughts he wasn't ready to voice yet. She sat beside him. 19 years, he said after a while. Yes. He was here before the second house was built. Before Clara. He paused. He's the only person who knew this place the way it was before any of it was... He stopped. Before it was worth anything. He knows it's worth something now, she said. That's why he's leaving satisfied. Gideon looked at the dark for another moment. Carter Webb is competent, he said. He's not Dutch. No one is Dutch, she said. Dutch is a category of one. A sound that was almost a laugh. He told me before he left for the evening that the hay order still needs to be reviewed annually and not just assumed forward. He shook his head. 20 years and his last piece of advice is about the hay order. Is the hay order wrong? It's fine. Then he was managing you, she said, giving you something practical to think about so you didn't have to think about the rest of it. Gideon was quiet. Probably, he said. He was good at that. They sat on the porch for a while longer, in the particular quiet of two people who have been together long enough that silence between them has its own texture. Not empty, but inhabited. The ranch was dark and large around them, the way it always was. The horses moved somewhere in the south paddock, audible without being visible. Thomas had left a boot on the porch steps, and it sat there in the dim light, absurd and domestic, evidence of an occupied house. I want to expand the cooperative, she said eventually. I know you do. 3 more operations in Kansas, maybe 1 in Missouri. The documentation standard is solid enough now that we could... Vivian, she stopped. Tomorrow, he said. Not dismissively, just as a boundary for tonight, and she understood and accepted it, and they sat in the quiet a little longer before the cold drove them inside. By 1913, the children had begun to take up space in the operation in ways that were no longer theoretical. Thomas, at 11, was riding with Carter Webb on the northern sections and asking questions that Webb answered with the patience of a man who has recognized that the questions are serious and the questioner will remember the answers. He had begun keeping his own notes on the horse bloodlines, separate from the official records, which were his observations and assessments, rougher than Vivian's system, less formal, but specific in a way that reflected genuine attention. She read them when he left them out, which he sometimes did deliberately, she thought, as a way of asking for feedback without asking. She wrote notes in the margins. He read them. Neither of them discussed this process directly, which was probably the right approach given that Thomas had, at 11, acquired the particular combination of pride and hunger for approval that made direct feedback a navigational challenge. Margaret, at 9, had gotten hold of a medical text that Dr. Briggs had lent to Vivian for reference during a period when one of the hands had had a persistent respiratory problem, and had read it with the focused intensity she brought to things she had decided were worth her time. Briggs, informed of this, had arrived at the ranch one Saturday with 2 additional books, smaller, written for general readers, but substantive, and had sat at the kitchen table with Margaret for an hour asking her questions about what she'd read. He reported to Vivian afterward, standing by his wagon preparing to leave, with the expression of a man who is surprised and is not entirely sure what to do with the surprise. "She understood the respiratory chapter," he said. "Yes," Vivian said. "She's 9. I'm aware." He looked at the house for a moment. "I'm going to bring more books," he said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," she said. Daniel, at 7, had begun following Carter Webb and the senior hands when disputes arose between workers, the ordinary friction of men doing hard work in close quarters, and observing how the disputes were handled or mishandled. He said very little during these observations. Afterward, he sometimes said things to Vivian in the direct and quiet way he had that indicated he was forming judgments about fairness and process that were more sophisticated than his age strictly explained. "Carter gave Hector the worst section of fence to repair," Daniel said one evening, "because Hector was the newest hand, but Hector did the repair better than anyone else would have, and Carter didn't say so." "Did you say something to Carter?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about this carefully. "Because he wasn't wrong," Daniel said. "He just wasn't complete." She looked at him. "That's a good distinction. Is there a word for it?" "There are several," she said. "I'll show you." She went and found the dictionary that lived on the second shelf of Gideon's office and brought it to the kitchen table, and they spent 40 minutes going through words that meant something close to what Daniel was describing. Incomplete justice, technical correctness without full honesty. And he listened with his characteristic focused patience and asked 2 questions, both of which were good ones. And at the end he said equitable in the particular way of someone testing whether a word fits a thing they've been thinking about for a while. "Close," she said. "But not exactly." "No," she said. "Not exactly. Some things don't have exact words. That's not the same as not being real." He nodded seriously. "I know," he said. He had always known, she thought, that the absence of a word wasn't the absence of a thing. That was perhaps the most natural understanding he carried. Gideon turned 60 in 1909. He did not mark the occasion himself. He had never been a man who marked his own occasions. But Vivian made supper that evening with more care than the standard weeknight meal, and Thomas produced a drawing of Cato that was unexpectedly accurate, and Margaret gave him a piece of paper on which she had written, in her largest and most deliberate handwriting, a list of things she considered his best qualities, which included knows horses and is honest most of the time and doesn't talk too much at breakfast. And Daniel gave him a stone he had found by the river that had an unusual shape, and that Daniel felt apparently was appropriate without being able to fully articulate why. Gideon looked at these things in order, and his face did the thing it did when something mattered to him, the specific controlled shift that was not a concealment but a management, because he was not a man for whom strong feeling had ever had an easy exit. He looked at Vivian across the table. "Thank you," he said. He meant all of it. The supper, the children, the decade that had assembled itself around him without his quite seeing it happen. The whole accumulated fact of a life that had turned out to be larger and fuller than the one he'd been living when he'd sat in the back row of a feed store with his hands in his pockets and done a calculation about what he needed. She looked back at him and said, "You're welcome." Just that. Because it was what was called for, and she had learned in 9 years to recognize what was called for and to provide it without excess. Later, after the children were in bed, he said, "I didn't think," and then stopped. She waited. "I didn't think, when I was building this place," he said, "that I was building it for anything. I was building it because building was what I could do and what I understood. The having of it, I didn't know what that was supposed to look like. He looked at his hands. I thought an heir, something to leave it to. I thought that was what I was missing. And now? He was quiet for a moment. Now I think what I was missing was people to build it with, rather than something to build it for. He stopped again. I'm not saying it the right way. You're saying it fine, she said. It's different. Building for something it keeps you at a distance from the thing. You're always oriented toward the future of it rather than the present of it. He looked at her. You changed that. Not by changing what I was doing, but by... He stopped, and she could see him reaching for something that didn't have a ready word, and she thought of Daniel and the dictionary and smiled. By being in it, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. By being in it. Outside, the Nebraska night was doing what it always did, pressing in from all sides, enormous and indifferent, not caring in the least what happened inside the houses that humans had built to withstand it. But the house was warm and full of sleeping children, and the horses were in the paddock, and the accounts were in order, and 3,000 acres of land had clear title and a future that several people were already arguing about in their separate ways. It was not the life either of them had been living when they arrived at the feed store in February of 1902. It was not what Gideon had imagined when he sat in that back row and did his calculation. It was not what Vivian had been hoping for when she stood on the platform and looked at a fixed point above the heads of the assembled men and refused to look at the floor. It was better than either imagining. Not because it was easy. It had been hard in the specific ways that real things are hard, the ways that don't make good stories but make real lives. But because it was honest. Built from honest work by imperfect people who had chosen, every ordinary morning, to keep building. That was the whole of it. That was what the dollar had bought. Not a wife, not an heir, not a household manager. The chance for two people to find out what they were capable of when someone was finally paying attention. Gideon set down his coffee cup and looked at the dark window for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Good night, Vivian," he said. "Good night," she said. "Yeah." She banked the fire. She listened to the house settle. She went upstairs past the doors of 3 sleeping children, Thomas with his notes on the bloodlines, Margaret with her medical books stacked by the bed, Daniel with whatever he was quietly working out behind his thoughtful eyes. And she went to bed in a room that was hers and had been for 11 years. And she slept well, the way people sleep when the day has been fully used. The cooperative agreement that Vivian had expanded to 11 operations by 1915 required, by that point, a full-time administrator, and the woman she hired for the position was a 26-year-old from Omaha named Ruth Carey, who had been working as a bookkeeper for a grain merchant and who arrived at the ranch for her interview with a leather case of organized documents and the specific alertness of someone who has spent years being underestimated and has decided to use that as information rather than injury. Vivian hired her after 40 minutes. Gideon, who had sat in on the interview at Vivian's request, waited until Ruth had driven back toward town and then said, "She reminds me of someone." "Don't," Vivian said without turning around from the window. "I wasn't being unflattering." "I know what you were being." She turned around. She was 50 now, her hair gone mostly gray in a way that she had neither encouraged nor fought. And there were lines around her eyes that belonged to a woman who had spent 15 years looking at account ledgers in insufficient light. She looked, in other words, like herself, specific and particular, not softened by the decades but clarified by them. She's better than I was at her age. She has more options, and she knows it, which means she's choosing this rather than arriving at it by elimination. Is that better? It's different, Vivian said. Choice without desperation. I'm not sure I'd have known what to do with that. He looked at her for a moment. You'd have managed, he said, which was as close to a particular kind of statement as Gideon Hartwell ever came, and she understood it and left it where he'd put it. Thomas took over the management of the northern sections in 1916 when he was 14, which was young by any reasonable measure, and which Carter Webb endorsed with the specific confidence of a man who has been watching someone develop for years and knows the difference between readiness and ambition. Thomas was both, but the readiness was the thing Webb was vouching for. He was not Gideon, which was the first and most important thing about Thomas as a ranch manager. Where Gideon had built through the force of a particular vision held and pressed against the world until the world gave way, Thomas built through relationship with the land, with the men, with the animals, with the systems that Vivian had put in place over 14 years and that he had been observing since he was old enough to sit at the kitchen table and follow a ledger column with his finger. He was demanding in his own way, but his demands came packaged in a quality of attention that people found, almost against their will, motivating. He remembered what individuals told him. He followed up. He noticed when something had improved and said so, plainly, which was not a thing that cost him, but that accumulated over time into a culture of a particular kind. Gideon watched his son manage the men and said nothing about it for months. Then one evening on the porch he said, "He does it differently than I do." "Yes," Vivian said, "it works." "Yes." A pause. "I'm not sure I could have done it that way." "No," she said, "but he couldn't have done it your way either. Your way built the thing. His way will keep it." She looked at the dark paddock. "They're different jobs." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "When did you work that out?" "About 3 years ago," she said. "I was watching him with Carter Webb and I saw it. He was going to be better at the people part than you are, and you were going to need to let that be true without making it smaller than it is." "Have I made it smaller?" "Not yet," she said. "I'm telling you ahead of time so you don't." He said nothing for a long moment, then, "That's what you do, isn't it? Tell me things ahead of time so I don't. When I can see them coming." "Can you always?" "No," she said honestly. "But I've gotten better at it." Margaret left for Lincoln in 1917, at 13, to live with a cousin of Vivian's and attend the better school there, because the Calhoun Flats school had given her everything it had, and she had consumed it completely, and was now, as Briggs said with the satisfaction of a man watching something he helped start arrive at its destination, simply waiting for more. She went with 4 medical books, 2 changes of clothes, and the composed determination of someone who has decided on a destination and is not interested in discussing the difficulty of the route. The morning she left, she and Vivian stood in the yard by the wagon for a moment before she climbed up. "Right," Vivian said. "I will. Not just about the schoolwork. Write about what you're finding difficult." Margaret looked at her. "Why?" "Because the difficult parts are the useful information," Vivian said. "The easy parts take care of themselves." Margaret considered this. "Did you do that? When things were difficult?" "I didn't write," Vivian said. "I didn't have anyone to write to. That's why I'm telling you." Margaret looked at her mother for a moment. The gray hair, the particular set of her shoulders that meant she was holding something in, the way she'd been holding something in since breakfast. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around her in the direct and slightly unpracticed way of a girl who is not naturally demonstrative, but has decided that the occasion warrants it. Vivian held her for a moment. Then Margaret climbed up onto the wagon and didn't look back, which was her way, forward attention, not backward, and Vivian stood in the yard and watched the wagon until the road took it, and then she went back inside and finished the morning accounts because that was what there was to do, and doing it was better than not doing it. Gideon found her at the kitchen table an hour later. He sat down across from her without speaking, which was the right thing to do. After a while he poured himself coffee and pushed the pot toward her, and that was the whole of it. The entire conversation. And it was sufficient because they had, by 1917, 15 years of practice at knowing what the other person needed and providing it without making a ceremony of the providing. The letter from Margaret arrived every 2 weeks, without exception, for the next 6 years. Vivian kept them in a box on the second shelf of the office, in order by date, and read them more than once. They were what she had asked for. Real accounts of real difficulty, written in Margaret's precise and unsentimental hand, telling the truth about what it cost to be a young woman, insisting on a path that the world had not prepared a smooth road for. The school in Lincoln was better than Calhoun Flats, but not, Margaret wrote in her 3rd letter, as good as it thought it was. The teachers were competent, but several of them held the particular opinion that girls in the advanced courses were an interesting experiment rather than a natural right. And this opinion expressed itself in small ways that Margaret cataloged with the clinical specificity of someone collecting evidence. Vivian wrote back. Her letters were shorter than Margaret's. She was not a natural correspondent, preferring conversation to the page. But they were direct, and they said the things that needed saying. That the opinion of teachers who viewed her as an experiment was information about them and not about her. That the evidence she was collecting was useful because it would tell her which battles were worth fighting and which were simply weather to be moved through. And that being the only woman in a room who fully understood what she was talking about was an advantage if she let it be one, because it meant no one was watching what she was doing closely enough to learn from it before she was ready to be learned from. Margaret wrote back, "That is the most strategically cold-blooded thing I have ever read, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Vivian showed this letter to Gideon. He read it and looked at her with an expression she had come to know well over 15 years. The one that meant he was seeing something he recognized, something that had been shaped partly by its proximity to him, and was now going out into the world as its own thing. "She's going to be formidable," he said. "She already is," Vivian said. "She's learning to aim it." The decade between 1915 and 1925 was the decade in which the Hartwell operation became something that people outside the immediate region knew about. Not famous, nothing so grand as that, but known in the specific way that things become known in the world of quality livestock and agricultural practice. Through reputation that travels by word of mouth between people who care about the subject and trust the people telling them. The cooperative's documentation standard, which Vivian had built from the first breeding records she'd kept in 1903, had been adopted by 23 operations across 4 states by 1920. The Hartwell bloodline had produced working horses in 8 states. Thomas had expanded the cattle operation in ways that were shrewd and careful and bore his particular signature. Not Gideon's aggressive expansion, but a slower, more deliberate growth that consolidated well before reaching further. And Vivian had, without particularly intending to, become someone that women in the county came to see. It started with Ruth Carey, who had a question about a contract dispute with one of the cooperative's member operations, and who came to Vivian not because Vivian was a lawyer, she was explicit that she was not, but because Vivian had been through the Voss dispute and had read more contract law than most people in the county, and because Ruth trusted her judgment. Vivian sat with her for 2 hours, and they went through the contract language together. And Vivian told her what she saw and what she'd do about it, and Ruth did it, and the dispute resolved in the cooperative's favor. After that, other women came. Not in a stream. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no public announcement. But steadily, 1 or 2 a month, women who had a situation they needed to think through, and who had heard from someone who had heard from someone that Vivian Hartwell would look at a problem clearly and tell you what she actually thought rather than what was comfortable to say. She was not always right. She said so when she thought she might not be. She sent people to Thaddeus Cray when the situation required a lawyer, and to Briggs when it required a doctor, and to their own better judgment when she thought that was the resource they were undervaluing. She did not set herself up as an authority on anything except what she had actually learned through experience, and that limitation was, counterintuitively, what made people trust her. A woman named Florence Hapscomb came in the spring of 1919 with a situation that was not unlike Vivian's own from 17 years earlier. A widow with limited options, looking at a set of choices that were all constrained and trying to identify the least bad one. She was younger than Vivian had been at the exchange, 28, with 2 children and a farm that had more debt than land, and a brother-in-law who was making it clear that he considered himself the natural next manager of both the farm and her situation. Vivian listened to her for an hour. Then she said, "What do you actually want? Not what you think you can have. What do you want?" Florence looked at her. "I want to keep the farm. Can you run it?" "I think so. I've been running it since my husband got sick 2 years ago." "Then the question isn't whether you can run it. The question is the debt." Vivian turned to the ledger she'd pulled out. "Tell me the numbers." Florence told her the numbers. Vivian listened and made notes and asked questions, and at the end she said, "The debt is manageable if the timeline is restructured. The bank you're dealing with, do they know you've been running the operation for 2 years?" "I don't think they've thought about it." "Then they need to," Vivian said, "because a bank that is deciding whether to extend patience to a debtor should know whether that debtor has demonstrated operational competence, and you have. That's not a small thing." She paused. "I'll write you a letter. Not vouching for your character. I don't know you well enough for that to mean anything, but documenting what I know about your operational situation from what you've told me in a form that the bank can use when making their assessment. Florence looked at her. Why would you do that? Vivian looked back at her. Because someone should have done it for me, she said simply, without drama. And because you asked the right question, which was the honest one. The bank extended Florence Hapscom's repayment timeline. She kept the farm. Her brother-in-law lost interest in managing her situation when the situation turned out to be more competently managed than he'd assumed. Vivian heard this secondhand from Ruth and filed it away with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to most things, not as a victory to be celebrated, but as a result to be noted and continued. Gideon's health began to change in 1922, in the gradual and initially deniable way that health changes in a man in his mid-60s who has spent 40 years doing physical work in a climate that is not kind. It was not dramatic. He was not the kind of man who permitted dramatic illness. He would have considered it a form of personal failure, which was not a reasonable position, but was entirely characteristic of him. What happened instead was a slow reduction in the radius of what he could do without it costing him more than it should. Vivian watched this and said nothing about it for months because she knew that saying something would cause him to resist it, and resistance would cost him energy he needed for other things. When she finally said something, she said it sideways, in the way she'd learned to say things to him when the direct approach was going to produce a wall. Thomas wants to take the spring cattle run this year, she said at breakfast in March of 1922. All of it. He thinks it's time. Gideon looked at her. He's managed the northern section for 6 years. I know. I told him it was his call. I wanted to tell you first. He was quiet for a moment. He knew what she was doing. After 20 years, he always knew what she was doing. And the thing that she had come to understand was that knowing and accepting were not always the same, but that he did both, which was the mark of a man who had learned something. All right, he said. You could go along and not manage it, she said. Just go. He looked at her. Just go. Watch, she said. There's value in watching what you've built. He went. He came back 3 weeks later looking tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of work. The tiredness of a man who has spent 3 weeks watching what he built being run well by someone else, and has been doing in the long, quiet hours of a cattle drive the accounting that this requires. He sat on the porch the evening he came back, and Vivian brought him coffee and sat beside him, and neither of them said anything about what the trip had meant, because it didn't need to be said. He does it differently, Gideon said after a while. Yes, it works. You said that before, about the men. I'm saying it again about the cattle. A pause. He's better at it than I was. She looked at him. This was not something Gideon Hartwell said easily. It was not the kind of statement that cost nothing. He had a better teacher, she said. He had you, Gideon said. He had both of us, she said, and he built the rest himself. That's how it's supposed to work. Margaret came home in 1923, at 19, not permanently. She was enrolled in a pre-medical program in Lincoln that she was going to finish. She was very clear about that. But for the summer, and she came home different in the way that young people come home from the first real encounter with the world outside the place that shaped them. Not unrecognizable, but resolved into a sharper version of the person they'd been becoming. She spent the summer reading, arguing with Briggs about the respiratory chapter of a book he'd given her 7 years ago that she now had detailed objections to, helping Vivian with the cooperative correspondence, and sitting with Gideon on the porch in the evenings in a way that was new. The two of them talking, actually talking, in the specific manner of people who have stopped relating to each other through the intermediate language of household routine and have started speaking directly. Vivian watched this from the kitchen window sometimes, the two of them on the porch in the long summer evenings, her husband, 64 and slower than he'd been, and her daughter, 19 and going somewhere nobody in Calhoun Flats County could fully follow her. And she thought about the distance between the feed store in 1902 and this porch in 1923, and the distance was not a thing she could fully hold in her mind at once, because it was too large and too full of specific days and specific choices and specific conversations that had each seemed ordinary at the time, but had accumulated into something that was not ordinary at all. One evening she heard Margaret say to Gideon, "Were you afraid when you made the offer at the auction?" A pause. Of what? Of being wrong. Of her being Not what you needed. Yes, Gideon said. I was afraid of that. But you did it anyway. I was more afraid of the alternative, he said, which was going home with nothing and continuing the way it had been going. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Is that what courage is? Being more afraid of not trying than of trying wrong. Vivian stopped washing the dish in her hands and stood at the window and listened. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. I think that's one kind, he said. Your mother would tell you it's the practical kind. She'd say there's a more foolish kind where you're not afraid enough. Which kind did she have? At the auction? Another pause. Ask her, he said. She'll give you a better answer than I will. Margaret came inside. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her mother with the particular directness that had always been her primary quality. No approach, no preamble, just the question. What were you afraid of, she said. At the auction, when you accepted. Vivian set down the dish. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd always tried to think about honest questions. I was afraid he was like the others, she said, that the difference was in the presentation and not in the man. And when did you know he wasn't? I didn't know. Not for a long time. She turned around and looked at her daughter. You don't know. You watch and you assess and you make the best call you can with the information you have, and then you stay alert and you adjust when you learn more. She paused. Anyone who tells you they knew from the beginning is editing their memory. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Is that what you tell the women who come here asking for advice? More or less. Do they listen? Some of them, Vivian said. The ones who aren't looking for permission to do what they've already decided. The ones who are genuinely asking. She picked up the dish again. Those ones listen. Gideon Hartwell died in the spring of 1928 on a Tuesday morning, which somehow seemed right. Not a Sunday, not a significant date, just a Tuesday, ordinary and unglamorous, which was the kind of day he'd always valued most because those were the ones where the actual work got done. He had been declining since 1925 in the way that could no longer be called deniable, and he had accepted this with the same controlled inward quality he brought to everything that cost him. He had stayed engaged in the operation as long as he was able to, sitting with Thomas in the evenings going over the accounts, walking the south paddock with the deliberate care of a man who knows each step is an expenditure. And when he was no longer able to do that, he had stayed engaged in smaller ways, reading the documentation that Vivian brought him, asking questions about the cooperative, listening to Daniel, 21 now, quiet and precise, describe the labor dispute on the eastern section that he was working to resolve with a combination of practicality and fairness that would have been foreign to the operation 20 years earlier. On the last good day, 3 weeks before the end, he and Vivian sat on the porch in the afternoon sun, which was warm in the particular way of Nebraska spring, tentative, as if the land isn't fully convinced yet that the cold is actually finished. He had a blanket across his legs that he hadn't asked for and that she'd put there anyway, and that he'd accepted without comment, which told her something. I've been thinking, he said, about the dollar. She looked at him. I've been thinking about what I thought I was buying, he said. At the time, what I thought the calculation was. He was looking at the paddock where 2 of Thomas's horses were moving in the afternoon light. I thought I was buying a solution to a problem. I thought I was being practical. You were being practical, she said. I was being practical about the wrong thing, he said. I was thinking about the household. I wasn't thinking about... He stopped. I wasn't thinking that a person could change what you thought was possible. I didn't know that was a thing that could happen. She was quiet for a moment. Neither did I, she said. He turned and looked at her. His face was older, deeply lined, the specific erosion of a man who has spent 69 years meeting weather. And it was the most familiar thing she had ever looked at, which still surprised her sometimes. The fact of that familiarity, how completely it had happened without her noticing the exact moment it did. I want to say something, he said, while I'm still saying things clearly. All right. You were worth more than anyone in that room could see. He said it plainly, not with the emotion that the words might carry in a different kind of story, not dramatically, just as a fact he was stating because it was true and he wanted it stated. Not because of what you did here, though that was more than I had any right to expect. But before that, before the ranch and the breeding program, and the cooperative in all of it. He paused. At the auction, standing on that platform. You were worth more than they could see. Vivian looked at the paddock for a moment, then she looked at him. So were you, she said, sitting in the back row, too proud to bid a reasonable amount. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Too honest to bid a reasonable amount, he said. There's a difference. There is, she said. It's one of your better qualities. They sat in the spring sun for a while longer, not talking, which was its own kind of talking by now. The long, inhabited silence of two people who have run out of anything they need to prove to each other and have arrived at the place where presence itself is the statement. He died 3 weeks later, early on a Tuesday, with Thomas on one side and Vivian on the other, and the sound of the ranch beginning its morning outside the window. The horses moving in the paddock, the distant voices of the hands, all the ordinary noise of a working day starting up regardless. He would have wanted it that way. She knew that without question. She was 56 when he died, and she lived for 23 more years, which surprised some people and did not surprise anyone who knew her. She ran the cooperative until 1935, when she handed the administrative work to Ruth Carey, who had been running most of it for years anyway, and who accepted the formalization with the composure of someone receiving something that was already true. She stayed involved in an advisory capacity, meaning she read everything and told Ruth what she thought, and Ruth took about 70% of it, which was the right percentage and which Vivian respected her for. Margaret finished her medical training in 1931, one of 7 women in her graduating cohort, a number that was both a sign of progress and an indication of how much progress remained to be made, which was a duality Margaret had made her peace with in the specific way of someone who has decided that imperfect progress is not the same as no progress. She practiced in Lincoln, eventually running the women's and children's clinic there, and she was known for the same quality that Briggs had recognized in her at 9 years old in the kitchen, the willingness to look at what was actually there rather than at what should theoretically be there according to the existing understanding. She came home to the ranch twice a year, every year, without fail. She sat with Vivian on the porch in the evenings, and they talked about medicine and about the cooperative and about Thomas's management decisions and about Daniel, who had gone into county administration and was making quiet, durable changes to the way labor disputes were handled in Millard County, changes that came from principles he had been working out since he was a boy. Watching Carter Webb give Hector the worst section of fence and fail to acknowledge the quality of the repair. Thomas ran the Hartwell operation for 40 years. He was not Gideon, which he had always known, and he had stopped needing to be Gideon sometime in his late 20s, which was the right time. He was, in his own way, just as consequential, not because he built the thing, but because he kept it, which is a different kind of work and not a lesser one. The horses the Hartwell Cooperative had documented became, by the 1940s, a recognized standard in regional breeding records, and the operation that Vivian had built her accounting systems around was still producing, still clear-titled, still paying the men who worked it at a rate that Daniel had helped establish as a county standard in 1938. Vivian watched all of this from the porch that she had sat on with Gideon for 26 years, and from the kitchen table where the morning accounts had been done since February of 1902, and from the east window of the bedroom that had been hers since the first night she'd arrived with a carpet bag and $12, and the particular fierce practicality of a woman who has decided she is going to work with what she has. She was still reading. She was still telling people what she thought when they asked, and occasionally when they didn't. She was still, at 70, capable of finding an error in a contract that 3 other people had read without finding it, which was not something she considered remarkable. It was simply the result of a lifetime of paying attention. And paying attention was a skill, and skills were developed by practice, and she had been practicing for a very long time. Ruth Carey said to her once, in the late 1940s, "You changed what I thought was possible for me. I want you to know I know that." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "You changed it yourself," she said. "I just didn't stand in the way." "That's more than most people get," Ruth said. Vivian thought about that. About the feed store in February of 1902, and a man who had sat in the back row and made an offer that wasn't what it appeared to be, and the cold outside, and the wagon road home. About every morning at the kitchen table since then, the accounts, the coffee, the specific quality of light through the east window in winter. About what it had cost, the whole of it, in the ways that don't appear in any ledger. The fear she'd carried and managed and refused to let govern her. The grief of the things that didn't happen. The long work of trusting something that had given her reasons not to trust it and then proved over time that it was worth the risk. Maybe, she said, but you have to be willing to walk through the door when it opens. Nobody can do that part for you. She died in 1951, in the same house she had arrived at 49 years earlier. She was 79 years old. Thomas was with her, and Margaret and Daniel, and several grandchildren who had grown up hearing the story of the feed store and the dollar and the wagon ride home, and who had understood, from the way their parents told it, that the story was not a love story in the conventional sense, not a story about romance, but something more durable and more particular than that. It was a story about what happens when two people decide to be honest with each other about what they need and then do the actual work of providing it. About the difference between a transaction and a partnership, which is not a philosophical distinction, but a practical one. You feel it in the operations, in the accounts, in the way the men work, in whether the harvest makes sense at the end of the year. 300 people came to the service, which was held in Calhoun Flats, in the town that had once been the county seat of a particular quality of dismissal toward the woman they were now assembled to honor. Some of them were old enough to remember the auction, or to remember being told about it, and they came with the complicated feeling of people who are reckoning with a community judgment that had been wrong in a way that time had made undeniable. Ruth Carey spoke. Margaret spoke, briefly, in the precise and unsentimental way she had always spoken, saying the true things without embellishment, because her mother would have found embellishment disrespectful. Thomas said nothing formally, but stood at the front of the room with the particular quality of a man holding something very large, very carefully, the way his father had stood in the bedroom doorway in November of 1902, looking at a son he hadn't expected. Daniel sat in the back row. He had chosen it deliberately, the way he chose most things, quietly, without announcing his reasoning. From the back he could see the whole room. He could see his brother and sister at the front. He could see 300 people gathered to say that a life had mattered. He could see, through the window at the side of the hall, the road that ran east out of town toward the ranch that was still running, still producing, still clear-titled and operational after half a century. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he thought about what his mother had told him when he was 7 years old and trying to find the right word for the thing Carter Webb had failed to do, the thing that was correct but not complete. She had said, "Some things don't have exact words. That's not the same as not being real." He had spent his adult life working in that space, the space between what the law said and what was fair, between what was technically correct and what was actually right. It was slow work and imperfect work and frequently frustrating work, and he had done it because she had taught him, by example rather than instruction, that the absence of a clear path was not a reason not to walk in the right direction. He thought about the dollar. He had seen it, the actual coin, once, when he was about 8 years old and had found it in a small wooden box in the top drawer of his mother's desk. He had asked her about it, and she had told him what it was, and he had looked at it for a long time, trying to understand how something so ordinary could be the beginning of something so large. She had said, "It wasn't the dollar. The dollar was just the mechanism. What mattered was what he was actually offering, and what I was actually accepting, which was neither of us being what the other one wanted, but both of us being willing to find out what was actually there." He had been 8 and had not fully understood that. He understood it now. The real investment had never been the coin. It had been the decision, made by 2 imperfect and frightened and pragmatic people in the cold outside a feed store, to take each other seriously, to look at what was actually there rather than at what was supposed to be there, to work with what was real. That was the whole of it. Not a grand gesture, not a rescue, just 2 people paying honest attention to each other, and everything that was built from that, and the 300 people in this room, and the ranch still running 22 miles east, and a daughter who had become a doctor, and a son who ran one of the most respected breeding operations in the region, and another son sitting in the back row of a hall in Calhoun Flats, having spent 20 years making things slightly more fair in a county that needed it. That was what a dollar had bought. Not because the dollar was the point. The dollar was never the point. The point was that someone had decided to pay attention when everyone else in the room had looked away, and that the woman standing on the platform had decided, in turn, to believe that the attention was real, and to walk through the door it opened. The point was that neither of them had been what the other expected, and that they had chosen, every ordinary morning for 26 years, to keep showing up anyway. Daniel Hartwell sat in the back row and looked at the room and thought that this was the only lesson worth inheriting. Not the land, not the horses, not the cooperative or the accounts or the documented bloodlines. Those things were real, and they mattered, and they were the evidence of a life well spent. But the lesson was simpler and harder than any of them. Pay attention to people. Do the actual work. Don't look away from what's real because it isn't what you planned for. Everything else followed from that. Everything had always followed from that. Outside, the Nebraska wind came down off the flat land the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and constant, moving through the town and past the hall and out across the miles of open country toward the ranch that was still there, still standing, still running in the morning light. It didn't care about any of it. It never had. But the people inside the hall did, and that in the end was the only thing that ever made any difference.